Picture this. It is May 1941, somewhere in the English countryside. Inside a Victorian mansion turned secret facility, a young woman pulls a piece of paper from a decryption machine. Her hands are shaking. Not from cold, from what she has just read. The message is German, naval coordinates, a wolf pack of U-boats positioning themselves along the convoy routes. She knows exactly where they are. She knows exactly which merchant ships are heading straight into that trap. Ships carrying food, medicine, ammunition. She walks down a corridor. Her footsteps echo on wooden floors. She reaches an office. A man in uniform sits behind a desk. She hands him the paper. He reads it. He folds it. He places it in a drawer. He does not pick up the telephone. He does not send a warning. He does not alert the convoy commanders who could change course, who could save those ships, who could save those lives. He makes a decision. The decision is to do nothing. 3 days later, 4 merchant ships go down in the North Atlantic. 217 men drown in water so cold it stops your heart in minutes. The information that could have saved them sat in a drawer the whole time. This happened. Not once, not twice, dozens of times throughout World War II. And here is what makes it so much worse. It was not incompetence. It was not confusion. It was strategy. Welcome. My name is Mr. H, and what I am about to share with you tonight is not the war you learned about in school. This is not about brave soldiers storming beaches or pilots in dogfights over the channel. Those things happened. They matter, but they are not what actually decided the war. The real war, the one that determined who lived and who died, who won and who lost, happened in locked rooms. In whispered conversations, in documents stamped so secret that some of them stayed classified for 50 years after the war ended. In decisions made by people whose names you have probably never heard. Let me give you another example. May 10th, 1941, the same month as that intercepted message. A German airplane crosses into British airspace. This is not unusual. German planes cross into British airspace every night to drop bombs, but this plane is not heading for London or Liverpool or any factory or port. The plane is a Messerschmitt 110, a fighter. It should not have the fuel range to reach Scotland from Germany, but it does, because someone removed the guns and filled the space with extra fuel tanks. The pilot bails out over a farm. He parachutes down. He tells the farmer who finds him that he has an urgent message for the Duke of Hamilton. He says he is on a peace mission. He says he has come to negotiate. His name is Rudolf Hess, and he is the Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, the third most powerful man in the Third Reich. To this day, 85 years later, we do not fully know why he flew to Scotland. We do not fully know who he was trying to meet. We do not fully know what deal he thought he could make. The British government arrested him. They questioned him. They did not announce his capture for 2 full days. And when they finally did announce it, they released almost nothing about what he said or why he came. He spent the rest of his life in prison, 46 years. He died in Spandau Prison in 1987, still the only prisoner there. The official story is suicide. He was 93 years old. A lot of people do not believe it. But here is what matters for our story tonight. Rudolf Hess flew to Britain because he believed there were people in the British government who wanted to make peace with Germany. He believed there was a faction, a group, a network of powerful people who saw the Soviet Union as the real enemy. Who thought Britain and Germany should not be fighting each other? Who thought they should be fighting together against Stalin? Was he right? Were there people in the British establishment who thought that way? Yes, absolutely. We know this now. We have the papers. We have the diaries. We have the private letters. There were members of parliament, aristocrats, business leaders, even people in intelligence services who saw the war as a mistake, who saw Hitler as a potential ally against communism. They did not get their way, but they existed. They had influence. They had access. They had conversations we will never fully know about. And that is the point. That is what this whole night is about. World War II was not just soldiers versus soldiers. It was factions within governments fighting each other. It was intelligence agencies keeping secrets from their own leaders. It was decisions to share information or hide it. Decisions to save lives or sacrifice them. Decisions made in rooms we were never meant to know about. At Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking centre, they broke the German Enigma code. What you might not know is that only 6 people knew the full extent of what they could read. 6 out of 10,000 people working there. Winston Churchill kept it so secret that even most of his own war cabinet did not know how much intelligence he actually had. And this created terrible choices. If you use every piece of intelligence you get, the enemy figures out you broke their code. They change the code. You lose your advantage. So you have to let some things happen. You have to let some ships sink. You have to let some cities get bombed. You have to choose who lives based on calculations about future advantage. On November 14th, 1940, British intelligence knew the Luftwaffe was going to bomb Coventry. They knew the exact date. They knew the target. Churchill made the decision not to evacuate the city, not to put up extra defences that would tip off the Germans. 568 people died that night. The intelligence source stayed secret. How do you live with that? How do you make that choice? I am not asking that to judge. I am asking because these are the kinds of decisions that actually shaped the war, not tactics on a battlefield, moral calculations in a cabinet room, and it went both ways. Hitler had his own internal wars. Hermann Goering hated Heinrich Himmler. Himmler hated Albert Speer. Everyone hated Martin Bormann, who controlled access to Hitler himself. The Nazi leadership spent as much energy fighting each other as fighting the Allies. Stalin was worse. Between 1936 and 1938, before the war even started, he executed 35,000 military officers. 35,000. He killed his own generals because he was paranoid about loyalty. This crippled the Soviet military right when they needed it most. When Germany invaded in June 1941, the Red Army had almost no experienced leadership left. Millions of Soviet soldiers died in the first 6 months, partly because Stalin had already killed the people who could have led them. These internal wars, these secret decisions, these hidden struggles, they killed more people than many famous battles, and we barely talk about them. So that is where we are going tonight. Into the rooms they did not teach you about, into the decisions that were classified for decades, into the wars within the war. I am going to show you documents. Real documents, declassified files, actual intercepts and memos and cables. I am going to name names. I'm going to give you dates and places and numbers. This is not conspiracy theory. This is just history that was inconvenient to talk about during the Cold War. History that complicated the simple story of good versus evil. Because the truth is always more complicated than the story. Now, if you are settling in for the night, if you are using this to help you sleep, that is exactly what I make these for. So, go ahead and turn down your screen brightness, get comfortable, maybe even turn the screen off completely, and just listen. And if you want, drop a comment and tell me where you are in the world and what time it is right now. I love knowing that someone in Australia is winding down while someone in Ohio is just getting into bed. That is part of what makes this feel like we are all in this together, even at odd hours, exploring the history they did not quite tell us. All right, let us start with the architecture of secrecy. Let us talk about how wars are really decided. Here is something they do not teach you in history class. The organizational charts you saw in textbooks, the ones showing clear chains of command from president to general to soldier, those are fictions. Useful fictions, maybe. The real decision-making structure of World War II looked nothing like what you were shown. It was a maze of parallel channels, secret committees, informal networks, and personal relationships that bypassed official hierarchies entirely. Let me show you what I mean. In Britain, Winston Churchill had an official war cabinet. 15 people. They met regularly. They debated strategy. They voted on major decisions. That is what the history books tell you about. But Churchill also had something else. He called it his ultra-secret circle. Only 6 people had full access to the intelligence coming out of Bletchley Park. 6. Edited summaries. Churchill would sit in cabinet meetings with information no one else in the room had. He would steer decisions based on intelligence he could not reveal because revealing it would expose the source. Imagine being in a meeting where you are arguing about where to send convoys, and one person in the room knows exactly where every German submarine is positioned, but he cannot tell you how he knows. So he just insists, he just pushes, and everyone else thinks he is being stubborn or irrational. But really, he is reading the enemy's mail. That was Churchill's reality for almost the entire war, and he did not stop there. Churchill had his war rooms, underground bunkers beneath Whitehall in London. But the war rooms were not just a safe place to hide during bombing raids. They were a parallel government. Down there, Churchill had his own map room, his own communications centre, his own staff who worked around the clock tracking every piece of the war. Above ground, the official government machinery ran. Below ground, Churchill ran his own operation. Now cross the Atlantic. Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing. Roosevelt had a cabinet. He had a State Department. He had all the official channels, and he ignored most of them. Instead, Roosevelt created what he called his map room in the White House. He modeled it directly on Churchill's setup. In that room, he had direct communication lines to Churchill that bypassed the State Department entirely. He had intelligence summaries that his own Secretary of State sometimes did not see. Roosevelt would send personal envoys on secret missions. Harry Hopkins, his closest advisor, had no official government position. None. He was just a guy Roosevelt trusted. But Hopkins travelled to London, to Moscow, to meet with Churchill and Stalin. He negotiated agreements. He made promises, all outside official diplomatic channels. In March 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States was officially neutral. Officially, America was not in the war. That is what Congress thought. That is what most Americans thought. But in March 1941, American and British military staff held secret meetings in Washington. They produced a document called ABC-1, American-British Conversations-1. This document committed the United States to a Germany-first strategy if America entered the war. It said that even if Japan attacked, which everyone expected, the US would focus on defeating Germany before dealing with Japan. This was a military alliance. In writing, Roosevelt knew about it. He approved it. He just never mentioned it to Congress or the American people. Why? Because he understood that official channels are slow. Official channels leak. Official channels involve too many people who might disagree. If you want to actually get things done in a war, you need a way to make decisions fast with people you trust. So he built his own structure, his own network, parallel to the official government. And then there is the really interesting part. Roosevelt and Churchill were not just running their own shadow governments. They were talking to each other constantly, directly, in ways their own governments did not fully know about. There was a man named William Stevenson, Canadian businessman, codename Intrepid. He ran British intelligence operations in the Western Hemisphere out of New York. His official cover was the British Security Coordination Office. Sounds boring, right? Stevenson had 3,000 people working for him. 3,000, running spy networks, propaganda operations, sabotage planning, all on American soil while America was still neutral. J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI knew about it. Roosevelt knew about it. They let it happen. They quietly cooperated. Stevenson was the private back channel between Churchill and Roosevelt. Messages that were too sensitive to go through official cables went through Stevenson. Proposals that needed to be tested before being officially suggested went through Stevenson. He was not on any organizational chart, but he was one of the most powerful people in the Allied war effort. Now let us look at the other side. Germany. Hitler had the Wehrmacht, the official military command. He had his cabinet, for what it was worth. But the real power structure was chaos. Deliberate chaos. Hitler believed in social Darwinism applied to government. He would give overlapping responsibilities to different people and let them fight it out. Whoever won the internal battle got the resources. He thought this produced the strongest leaders. What it actually produced was a government at war with itself. Hermann Goering ran the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. He hated Heinrich Himmler, who ran the SS and the entire police apparatus and the concentration camp system. Himmler hated Albert Speer, who ran armaments production. Speer hated Martin Bormann, who controlled access to Hitler. They spent more time sabotaging each other than fighting the Allies. Here is a real example. In 1943, Germany was desperately short of aircraft. The Luftwaffe was getting destroyed over Germany by Allied bombers. Speer wanted to convert factories to produce more fighters, but those factories were making things for the SS. Not because he had a better strategic idea, because he did not want Speer to get credit. He did not want Goering's Luftwaffe to get stronger relative to his SS. Thousands of German cities got bombed while these men argued about bureaucratic turf, and nobody could override them except Hitler. But Hitler by 1943 was sleeping until noon, watching movies, ranting for hours about dog breeding or vegetarianism or Wagner operas. Getting a decision out of him required getting through Bormann, who controlled his schedule. Bormann would schedule meetings or not schedule them based on his own power games. The Nazi government was basically a reality show where the prize was control over a dying regime. The Soviet Union was different, not better, different. Stalin trusted no one. So instead of parallel power structures, he created a system where everyone spied on everyone else. The NKVD, the secret police, spied on the military. Military counterintelligence spied on the NKVD. The Communist Party apparatus spied on both, and Stalin had personal informants in all of them, reporting directly to him. This meant that no one could build an independent power base, which was exactly what Stalin wanted. But it also meant that no one could tell him the truth. In June 1941, Soviet intelligence had clear evidence that Germany was about to invade. Warnings from spies in Germany, from British intelligence, from Soviet agents in Japan who had intercepted German communications. The date, the troop positions, everything, Stalin ignored it. He thought it was disinformation. He thought Churchill was trying to trick him into provoking Germany. He was so convinced of his own strategic genius that he dismissed his own intelligence agencies. When Germany actually invaded on June 22, 1941, Soviet forces were caught completely unprepared. Not because they had no warning, because their leader did not believe the warning. 3 million Soviet soldiers were captured in the first 3 months. 3 million, many of them because they had no orders, no leadership, no clear chain of command that could function when the top of the pyramid was in denial. But here is the thing about all these parallel structures and shadow networks and informal channels. They worked. Kind of. At least, the Allied ones worked better than the Axis ones. Roosevelt and Churchill could make decisions in hours that would have taken their governments weeks. They could coordinate strategy without 20 committees arguing about it. They could keep secrets. They could move fast. The cost was accountability. Nobody elected William Stephenson. Nobody voted on the ABC-1 agreement. The people making the decisions were not the people who were supposed to make the decisions according to any constitution or government structure. But in war, speed matters. Secrecy matters. And sometimes democracy is too slow. There was another player I should mention. His name was Reinhard Gehlen, German general, head of intelligence for the Eastern Front. He knew everything about Soviet military capabilities. Everything. In April 1945, as Germany was collapsing, Gehlen saw what was coming. He microfilmed his entire archive on Soviet intelligence. He buried the microfilm in the Bavarian Alps, then he surrendered to the Americans. And he offered them a deal, his intelligence archive in exchange for his freedom and funding to keep his network running. The Americans took the deal. By 1946, Gehlen was running anti-Soviet intelligence operations for the United States. Many of his agents were former Nazi officers. The Americans did not care. They wanted the intelligence. The organization Gehlen built eventually became the BND, West German Intelligence. He ran it until 1968. A Nazi spy master became one of the founding pillars of Western Cold War intelligence, not in spite of the Americans. This is the architecture of secrecy, parallel governments, private channels, networks that do not appear on any official chart, decisions made by people you never heard of in rooms you did not know existed. And that architecture did not just exist during the war, it shaped everything that came after. The CIA grew directly out of wartime networks. The special relationship between Britain and America grew out of Churchill and Roosevelt's private channel. The Cold War intelligence infrastructure was built by people like Galen, who switched sides but kept their methods. When you understand this, you understand that the war was not really Britain versus Germany or America versus Japan. It was networks versus networks. Secret structures competing with each other, and the side with better secret structures, with faster decision-making, with tighter control of information, that side won. Not because they had better soldiers, because they had better secrets. Let me tell you about a photograph that did not exist. August 23rd, 1939. Moscow. The Kremlin. There is a signing ceremony happening. On one side of the table sits Vyacheslav Molotov, Soviet foreign minister. On the other side, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi foreign minister. Behind them, smiling, watching, is Joseph Stalin himself. They are signing a non-aggression pact. Germany and the Soviet Union promise not to attack each other. This is public. This gets announced. The world is shocked because just months earlier, Hitler had been ranting about the Bolshevik menace, and Stalin had been calling Nazis fascist dogs. But that photograph, the one of them signing, that photograph was carefully composed, because what the camera did not show, what was not announced, what stayed hidden for decades, was the second document they signed that same night. The secret protocol. In that document, Germany and the Soviet Union divided Eastern Europe between them, like two neighbors splitting up a yard. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Eastern Poland goes to the Soviets. Western Poland goes to Germany. Bessarabia, part of Romania, goes to the Soviets. They drew lines on a map and decided the fate of 100 million people. And nobody knew. Not the Poles, not the French, not the British. Nobody. 1 week later, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 2 weeks after that, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. They met in the middle. They divided the country exactly along the line they had secretly agreed on. Poland ceased to exist. The Soviets called it liberation. They said they were protecting Ukrainians and Belarusians from German aggression. That was the official story. The story they stuck to for 50 years. The truth was, they had conspired with Hitler to carve up a country that had diplomatic relations with both of them. A country that trusted at least one of them not to stab them in the back. Now here is where it gets interesting. The Western allies, Britain and France, they knew something was wrong. They could see that Soviet and German troops were coordinating. They could see the border they established was too clean, too planned, but they had no proof of a secret agreement. Germany and the USSR both denied it. They said it was just coincidence, just strategic necessity. The proof stayed locked in Soviet archives for 46 years. In 1945, when Allied forces captured German government buildings in Berlin, they found a copy. They found the actual text of the secret protocol. Germany had kept their copy of the deal. The Western Allies, the Americans and British, they now had documentary evidence that Stalin had been Hitler's partner, that the Soviet Union had worked with the Nazis to start World War II, and they kept it secret. Why? Because by 1945, the Soviet Union was an ally. Millions of Soviet soldiers had died fighting Germany. The Red Army was occupying Eastern Europe. Starting a propaganda war with Stalin over something that happened 6 years earlier seemed like a bad idea when they were trying to finish off Japan and figure out what peace would look like. So they kept it quiet. They had the document. Stalin, meanwhile, knew they had it. And he knew they knew, and he kept denying it anyway. Official Soviet position. The secret protocol is Nazi propaganda. It never existed. Any documents claiming it exists are forgeries. This went on for decades. Soviet historians had to pretend it never happened. Polish historians who tried to mention it got censored or worse. The official Soviet encyclopedia had no entry for it. When Western historians would cite the German documents, Soviet representatives at the UN would call them liars. It was not until 1989, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, that Mikhail Gorbachev finally admitted it. He published the text. He acknowledged it was real. 50 years of lying ended with a quiet statement in a newspaper. But the pact did not just divide Poland. It enabled something much darker. See, when Germany invaded Poland, the world understood it as aggression. But when the Soviet Union invaded 2 weeks later, Britain and France did not declare war on them. They condemned it. They called it unfortunate, but they did not fight. Why not? Partly because they were already fighting Germany and did not want another enemy. Partly because they still hoped the Soviet Union might eventually turn against Germany. Partly because invading the Soviet Union from Western Europe was geographically impossible. But the result was that Stalin got away with it. He got Eastern Poland. He got the Baltic states, which he invaded and annexed in 1940. He got part of Romania, and the Western Allies just watched. This taught Stalin something important. He learned that he could grab territory, and the West would complain but not fight. That lesson shaped his entire post-war strategy. Now, let me tell you what happened in the territory Stalin took. The Soviets did not just occupy Eastern Poland, they reshaped it. They arrested Polish military officers, police, government officials, intellectuals, priests, anyone who might organize resistance. They sent them to camps. In April and May of 1940, in the Katyn forest near Smolensk, the NKVD executed about 22,000 Polish prisoners. They buried them in mass graves. The Soviets denied this for 50 years too. When the Germans discovered the graves in 1943, they announced it to the world. They brought in international investigators. They used it for propaganda. Look what the Bolsheviks do. The Soviet response was to claim the Germans did it. They said the Germans captured those Polish officers in 1941 and executed them and buried them and blamed the Soviets. Never mind that the Soviets had been holding those men since 1939. Never mind that witnesses saw NKVD trucks. Never mind forensic evidence about when they died. Official Soviet position: German atrocity. The Western Allies had evidence it was the Soviets. They had interrogation reports from German POWs. They had testimony from Polish underground sources. But again, they kept quiet. At the Nuremberg trials in 1946, the Soviets tried to charge the Germans with the Katyn massacre. The American and British prosecutors quietly declined to pursue it. They knew, they just did not want to blow up the alliance over it. It was not until 1990, after the Soviet Union admitted the secret protocol, that they finally admitted Katyn too. 50 years of blaming Germany for something the NKVD did. But let us go back to 1939. Because the pact was not just about dividing territory. It had an economic component that nobody talks about. On August 19th, 1939, 4 days before the political pact, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a massive trade agreement. The Soviet Union would supply Germany with oil, grain, manganese, platinum, raw materials. Germany would supply the Soviets with industrial equipment, weapons technology, manufacturing tools. This trade continued even after the war started. Even while Germany was fighting Britain and France, Soviet trains were delivering oil to German refineries. Soviet wheat was feeding German soldiers. Soviet resources were fueling the Wehrmacht. Why did Stalin do this? Why help Hitler conquer Europe? Because Stalin thought he was being clever. He thought he could keep Germany pointed west. Let Hitler fight Britain and France. Let the capitalist powers destroy each other. The Soviet Union stays out of it, gets rich selling resources, and eventually picks up the pieces. It was a gamble. And it failed catastrophically. On June 22nd, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union with 3 million men, the largest invasion in human history. And Stalin was caught completely off guard. Not because he had no warning. He had plenty of warning. But because he had convinced himself that Hitler would not dare betray their partnership. In the first 6 months, Germany captured 3 million Soviet soldiers, killed another million, and got within sight of Moscow. The Soviet Union came closer to total collapse than most people realize. All because Stalin had made a deal with a dictator he thought he could manipulate. But here is the part that really matters for understanding World War II and everything that came after. The secret protocol and the Katyn massacre and all of it that became the foundation of Cold War mistrust. When the war ended and Stalin started demanding control of Eastern Europe, when he installed communist governments in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The Western Allies remembered. They remembered that Stalin had already divided up Eastern Europe once before with Hitler. They remembered he had lied about it for years. They remembered Katyn. They remembered that the Soviet Union had helped start the war they all just spent 6 years fighting. And Stalin remembered that they had kept his secrets, that they had evidence of his crimes and stayed silent, that they needed him. So the whole post-war order, the whole Cold War, it was built on this foundation of mutual knowledge and mutual deception. Both sides knew things about each other. Both sides had leverage. Both sides had reasons not to trust each other. The Iron Curtain that fell across Europe in 1946, it fell almost exactly along the lines drawn in the secret protocol of 1939. Stalin took what he had already once agreed to take with Hitler. He just took it from Hitler instead of with him. Poland, the country whose invasion supposedly started World War II, the country that Britain and France went to war to defend, Poland ended up under Soviet control anyway. For 45 years, the betrayal of August 1939 just got repeated in a different form in 1945. And we did not talk about this much during the Cold War. We talked about Berlin and Cuba and Vietnam. We talked about nuclear weapons and space races. We did not talk much about how it all started, about the fact that the two systems that ended up dividing the world had begun by dividing it together. Your history textbook probably mentioned the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Maybe a paragraph. Maybe a page. It probably did not mention the secret protocol, or if it did not explain how long it stayed secret or why. It probably did not connect it to what came after. Not because your teachers were lying, because this history was inconvenient. It complicated the narrative. It made the good guys look less good. It raised questions about what we knew and when we knew it and why we stayed silent. But the documents exist now. They are public. You can read the secret protocol yourself. You can read about Katyn. You can see Stalin's signature on a deal with Hitler, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to the simple story about World War II being a fight between good and evil. It was more complicated than that. It was empires making deals. It was dictators carving up countries. It was lies told for decades by multiple governments, including our own. The war within the war started before the war even began. It started with a secret handshake in Moscow and a map with lines drawn through the hearts of nations. There is a moment that one of the Bletchley Park codebreakers talked about years later, after the secrecy was finally lifted. She said she remembered sitting at her station, working through the daily key settings for Enigma, and suddenly the message cleared. German, readable, and it was an order to a U-boat group. Target coordinates, convoy route, attack time. She said she looked at the clock. She did the math in her head. The convoy was 12 hours away from the ambush point. There was time, plenty of time to warn them, to reroute the ships, to save them. She passed the decrypt up the chain. That was her job. Decrypt and pass it along. Someone else decided what to do with it. She never found out what happened to that convoy. They were not allowed to follow up. They were not allowed to ask. They just kept decrypting and passing along and never knowing which warnings were sent and which ones were filed away. She said that not knowing was almost worse than knowing, because in your mind, you saved them all. Or you killed them all. And you would never find out which. Let me tell you about Bletchley Park. It was a Victorian mansion about 50 miles northwest of London. Before the war, it belonged to a wealthy family. In 1938 and 39, the British government quietly bought it and started recruiting people. Mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle experts, anyone who was good at patterns. By 1940, there were hundreds of people there. By 1943, there were 10,000. Working in shifts around the clock. Breaking codes. The main target was Enigma, German's cipher machine. It looked like a typewriter with a plug board and 3 or 4 rotors. You would type in a letter, and a different letter would light up. The settings changed daily. The number of possible combinations was in the billions. Unbreakable. That is what the Germans thought. And it almost was. But in December 1932, a team of Polish mathematicians had figured out a way in. They built a machine called a bomber that could test possible settings mechanically instead of by hand. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Polish codebreakers escaped to France and shared everything they knew with the British. The British took that foundation and built on it. A mathematician named Alan Turing designed a better machine. They called it the bomb. Not a bomb, Bombay. A tribute to the Polish machine. By late 1940, Bletchley Park was reading some German naval traffic. Not all of it, not every day, but enough. Enough to know where U-boats were hunting. Enough to reroute convoys. Enough to save ships. And it worked. Merchant ship losses dropped. The Battle of the Atlantic started turning. Germany could not figure out why. They kept checking their Enigma machines. The machines were fine. The system was secure. So how were the British avoiding their submarines? The Germans suspected spies. They suspected radar. They suspected lucky guessing. They never suspected that their unbreakable code was being read in a country estate in Buckinghamshire by people who had never fired a gun. But here is the catch. If you use all the intelligence, if you save every convoy, if you avoid every ambush, eventually the enemy notices. Eventually they figure out you are reading their messages. And then they change the system and you lose everything. So you have to ration it. You have to let some things happen. You have to make choices about which intelligence to act on and which to ignore. This fell to a small group of people. The ultra secret, they called it. Ultra was the classification level above top secret. Only a handful of people knew the full scope of what Bletchley Park could do. Churchill knew. A few intelligence chiefs knew. Most military commanders did not. Most of the cabinet did not. Those few people, they had to decide. This convoy gets saved. That one does not. This city gets extra defences. That one does not. The most famous example is Coventry. November 14th, 1940. Bletchley Park decrypted a German order. Luftwaffe bomber groups were being positioned. Target: Coventry. An industrial city in the Midlands. Factories making aircraft engines. Munitions. Also home to 70,000 people. The decrypt gave the date. The target. Everything. What do you do with that information? If you evacuate the city, the Germans notice. If you flood the area with extra fighters and anti-aircraft guns, the Germans notice. And they ask themselves how the British knew, and maybe they changed their codes. And then you lose the ability to read their messages for the rest of the war, or you let it happen. You put up normal defences. You let the people of Coventry sleep in their beds, not knowing what is coming, and 568 of them die. And you live with that. Churchill made the decision. Normal defences only. No evacuation. No special warning. On the night of November 14th, 449 German bombers hit Coventry. They dropped 500 tons of high explosives and 30,000 incendiary bombs. The city centre burned, the medieval cathedral was destroyed, factories were damaged, and 568 people died. The British press called it a terror bombing, an atrocity. The Germans never suspected their codes were broken. Enigma stayed compromised for the rest of the war. Later, after it all came out, people argued about this decision. Some said Coventry was going to be hit anyway and the intelligence just confirmed it. But the core question remained. How many lives is a secret worth? Coventry was not the only time. There were convoys, there were ships. British intelligence would know a convoy was sailing into a U-boat pack. They would warn some convoys, reroute them, save them, but not all of them. Not every time. There was a calculation. If you save too many, the Germans get suspicious. So you let some die to avoid suspicion. How do you decide which convoy lives and which one dies? There was a formula. Strategic value, cargo importance, but also randomness. You could not always save the important ones and sacrifice the unimportant ones. That would create a pattern. Sometimes you had to let an important convoy go just to maintain the deception. Think about being the person who makes that choice. You are sitting in an office in London. You have a list of convoys. You know which ones are carrying fuel, which ones are carrying food, which ones are carrying ammunition. You know where the U-boats are. You know which convoys will be attacked, and you pick. The captains of those ships never knew. The merchant sailors never knew. The naval escorts never knew. They had no idea their fates were being decided in a locked room based on protecting a secret. Thousands of men drowned in the North Atlantic. Some of them could have been saved. They were not. Not because of enemy action, because of friendly calculation. Now, let me be clear about something. I am not saying this was wrong. I am not saying Churchill was a monster. I am saying this was the reality. This was what using intelligence meant in practice. It meant making terrible choices. And it was not just the British. The Americans did it too once they got into the war and started sharing ultra-intelligence. In 1942, the US Navy was reading Japanese naval codes. Not Enigma, different system, but same principle. They knew Japan was planning to attack Midway Island. They knew the date. They knew the force composition. They used that intelligence to set an ambush. They won the battle. They turned the tide of the Pacific War. But to protect the source, they had to pretend they did not know. They sent out extra reconnaissance flights so it would look like they spotted the Japanese fleet by patrol aircraft. They made sure there was a cover story, a plausible explanation for how they knew. Meanwhile, there were other Japanese operations they knew about. Smaller attacks, raids on different islands, and sometimes they let those happen without warning because warning every target would be suspicious. Men died on those islands. Marines, soldiers, sailors. They could have been reinforced. They were not. After the war, when this started coming out, when the Enigma story was finally declassified in the 1970s, there was a lot of anger. Veterans felt betrayed. Families of men who died felt betrayed. Why did you let my father die when you could have saved him? And there is no good answer to that. There is just the calculation. Saving him would have cost more lives later. Saving him would have revealed the source. Saving him would have lost the war. Maybe that is true. Maybe the calculations were right. Maybe Ultra shortened the war by 2 years. Maybe it saved 1 million lives overall. That is what the historians say now. That is what the official assessments concluded. But tell that to the widow whose husband drowned because his convoy was not rerouted, even though someone in London knew the U-boats were there. Tell her it was worth it. Tell her the secret was more important than his life. She might understand intellectually, but understanding does not make it hurt less. And here is another layer to this. The people making these decisions, they could not talk about it. Not during the war. Not after the war. Not for 30 years. Churchill died in 1965, never having publicly acknowledged Ultra. He wrote 6 volumes of war memoirs. He never mentioned Bletchley Park. He never mentioned Enigma. He took the secret to his grave because it was still classified. The codebreakers who worked at Bletchley Park, they were told when the war ended to never speak of it. Ever. They signed the Official Secrets Act. Some of them worked there for years alongside people who became their best friends, and they could never tell anyone, not even each other after they left, what they had really done. Imagine that. You helped win the war. You broke the unbreakable code. You saved thousands of lives, and you can never tell anyone. Your children grow up not knowing what you did. Your spouse does not know. Your neighbors think you had some boring clerical job, and you carry the weight of the choices that were made, the convoys that were not warned, the cities that were not evacuated. You carry that in silence. It was not until 1974 that the British government finally declassified the Enigma story. Suddenly, all these elderly people could finally talk about what they did during the war. Finally, they could tell their families. Finally, they could explain. But by then, many of the people who made the hardest decisions were dead. The people who could have explained why this convoy lived and that convoy died, they were gone. All we have are the records, the decrypt logs, the dates, the numbers. We can see what they knew and when they knew it. We can see which warnings were sent and which were not. What we cannot see is what it felt like to make those choices. We cannot see the faces of the people who signed off on letting a city burn. We cannot hear the conversations they had late at night when they were alone with what they had done. We just have the results. and 568 people died in Coventry. And thousands more died on ships that sailed into ambushes they could have avoided. And we will never know their names. We will never know if saving them would have changed anything. We just know that someone decided their lives were worth less than a secret. That is the intelligence war. That is what breaking Enigma actually meant. Not just clever mathematicians and fancy machines. Blood, sacrifice, choices that haunt you. And the people who made those choices, they could not even talk about it. Before we go further into these shadows, I want to pause for just a moment. If this kind of history resonates with you, the hidden decisions, the uncomfortable truths they did not teach in school, a like or a comment genuinely helps others find these stories. No pressure at all. Just, if it is landing with you, that small gesture helps. Now, let me tell you about the spies who turned the war into theatre. About deception so elaborate it sounds like fiction. Except it is all documented, all real. War makes liars of everyone. But some people turned lying into an art form. Let me tell you about a committee that met in a nondescript office building in London. They called themselves the 20 Committee, wrote it as Roman numerals, XX, 20, but also double cross. Get it? These were the people who ran every German spy in Britain. Here is what happened. When the war started, Germany sent spies to Britain, trained agents, people with radios and codes and missions. They were supposed to gather intelligence, report on troop movements, factory output, defensive positions, standard espionage. The British caught them, all of them, within weeks, some within hours of landing. Germany's spy training was surprisingly bad. They would drop someone by parachute in the Scottish Highlands with a radio, a wad of cash, and instructions to blend in, except the person did not speak English properly, or they had German cigarettes in their pocket, or they tried to pay for things with pre-war currency that was no longer in circulation. The British Home Guard would find them wandering around looking confused. Local police would arrest them. MI5 would take them to interrogation facilities, and then MI5 would make them an offer. Work for us, or face execution as a spy. So now, Britain had captured German spies, but instead of just locking them up, the 20 Committee did something brilliant. They turned them. They had the spies continue radioing Germany, continue sending reports, except now MI5 wrote the reports. Germany thought their spy network in Britain was functioning. They were receiving regular intelligence updates. They had no idea that every single report was fiction written by British intelligence officers. This was the double-cross system, and it ran for the entire war. Germany never caught on. Now, you might think the British would just send false information, make things up. But it was more sophisticated than that. If you only send lies, eventually the enemy figures it out. Your intelligence does not match reality. Your sources lose credibility. So the double-cross system sent mostly true information. Boring true information. Troop movements that did not matter. Factory production that was already public knowledge. Stuff that could be verified. This built credibility. And then, at crucial moments, they would slip in the lies. The most successful double agent was a Spanish man named Juan Pujol Garcia. The British called him Agent Garbo because he was such a good actor. The Germans called him Arabelle. They thought he was their best source in Britain. Here is the thing about Pujol. He was not recruited by either side. He recruited himself. In 1941, he was living in Lisbon, Portugal, neutral territory. He hated fascism. He wanted to help the Allies. So he walked into the British embassy and offered to spy for them. The British turned him down. They did not trust him. They thought he might be a German plant. So Pujol did something insane. He decided to spy for Germany so he could betray them to Britain and prove his loyalty. He contacted the Germans. He said he was a Spanish diplomat who could travel to Britain. They recruited him. They gave him invisible ink, a code, an address in Lisbon where he could send letters. Then Pujol moved to Lisbon and started sending the Germans intelligence reports about Britain. Except he had never been to Britain. He was making it all up. He was writing fake spy reports about a country he had never visited, using a guidebook and a map. and the Germans believed him. They thought his information was excellent. Pujol invented fake sub-agents. He said he had recruited people across Britain, a pilot in the RAF, a dock worker in Liverpool, a secretary in the War Office. None of these people existed, but Pujol would write reports from their perspectives. Different handwriting, different personalities. He created an entire fictional spy network out of his imagination. Eventually, British intelligence noticed that Germany seemed to have a source in Britain who was reporting accurate things. Except Britain had not noticed any actual German spy. They investigated. They tracked the reports back to Lisbon. To Pujol, they finally realized this guy had been trying to help them all along. In April 1942, MI5 brought him to London and put him to work for real. Now Pujol had British intelligence writing his reports. His fictional spy network grew to 27 fake people. The Germans were paying him for information from agents who did not exist. They gave him more money so he could recruit more fake agents. At one point, MI5 had to invent a fictional death for one of the fake agents because the character's story was getting too complicated to maintain. The Germans never suspected. They thought Pujol was brilliant. They paid him. They gave him medals. He was their most trusted source. And then came D-Day, June 6, 1944. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They just did not know where. Calais was the obvious choice. Shortest distance across the Channel. Best port facilities. Closest to Germany. Normandy was less obvious. Longer crossing. More difficult beaches. Farther from strategic targets. The Allies needed the Germans to think it was Calais. They needed German forces positioned at Calais, not Normandy. So they used Pujol. He sent reports from his fake agents. Troop sightings in southeast England. Training exercises near Dover. All suggesting Calais. The Germans reinforced Calais. On June 6th, the Allies landed at Normandy, and Pujol sent an urgent message to Germany. He said his agents had just learned the real invasion was at Normandy. He was warning them, too late to stop the landings, but in time for them to verify his information was correct. Then, a few days later, he sent another message. He said Normandy was a diversion. The real invasion, the big one, was still coming at Calais. 50 divisions, American General George Patton in command, preparing to cross at Calais. None of this was true. Patton was in England, but he was not commanding anything. The 50 divisions did not exist, but the Germans believed Pujol. They kept forces at Calais for weeks, waiting for an invasion that never came. Forces that could have been in Normandy, stopping the actual invasion. This was part of a larger deception called Operation Fortitude. The British created an entire phantom army, inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, dummy landing craft, all positioned in southeast England to make it look like the Calais invasion force was real. German reconnaissance planes photographed the fake equipment. German intelligence intercepted the fake radio messages. Everything confirmed what Pujol was reporting. It all fit together. The deception worked so well that even after the Normandy landings, even after Allied forces were pushing inland, Hitler kept divisions at Calais. He was convinced the real attack was still coming. He thought Normandy was the diversion. By the time Germany figured it out, it was too late. After the war, Germany awarded Pujol the Iron Cross for his service to the Reich. Britain gave him the Member of the Order of the British Empire for his service to the Crown. He is the only person to receive high honours from both sides. He faked his own death in the 1950s and disappeared. Lived quietly in Venezuela. Was not discovered until the 1980s, when a writer tracked him down. By then he was an old man who had pulled off one of the greatest deceptions in history, and nobody knew. But let me tell you about an even stranger deception. Operation Mincemeat, April 1943. The Allies were planning to invade Sicily. The Germans knew an invasion was coming somewhere in the Mediterranean. The question was where. Sicily was the obvious target. Too obvious. British intelligence wanted the Germans to think the target was Greece or Sardinia, not Sicily. How do you convince the enemy of this? You could send fake radio messages, but those might not be believed. You could use double agents, but that was risky. You need something the Germans would absolutely trust. Someone had an idea. What if a dead body washed up in Spain carrying documents about the invasion plans? Spain was neutral, but friendly to Germany. Spanish authorities would hand the documents to the Germans. The Germans would think they had lucked into genuine intelligence from a drowned British courier. So British intelligence found a corpse, a homeless man named Glyndwr Michael, who had died in London. No family, no one looking for him. They got permission to use his body. They dressed him as a Royal Marines officer, Major William Martin. They created an entire fake identity. Love letters from a fictional fiancé, receipts from a London tailor, theatre ticket stubs, a photo of the fiancé, actually a photo of an MI5 secretary. They gave this dead man a whole life, then they chained a briefcase to his wrist. Inside the briefcase were documents about Allied invasion plans. The plans said the main invasion would hit Greece. Sicily was mentioned as a diversion. They put the body in a submarine. They took it to the coast of Spain. They dumped it in the water near a town where they knew the current would wash it ashore and where they knew Spanish authorities would find it. The body washed up. Spanish fishermen found it. They called authorities. The briefcase was recovered. The documents were photographed by Spanish intelligence and passed to the Germans. The Germans analysed them. Were they genuine? The body had been in the water. The decomposition matched the timeline. The personal effects were convincing. The documents used proper military terminology, proper formatting, proper security classifications. Germany decided they were real. They moved forces to Greece. They reinforced Sardinia. They left Sicily less defended. On July 9th, 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. The reduced German presence there helped the invasion succeed. A homeless man who died of rat poison in London had helped win a battle he never knew about in a war he barely understood. They buried him in Spain under a false name with military honours. There is a gravestone. Major William Martin died on active service. The Spanish still maintain the grave. They have no idea who is actually buried there. Think about that for a moment. British intelligence argued about which dead body to use. They needed someone with no family who would ask questions. Someone whose death was recent enough that the body was still usable. Someone who looked about the right age to be a major. The details they worried about. Would the Germans notice the corpse had not drowned but died of poison? They consulted pathologists. Would seawater decomposition hide the real cause of death? Probably. Would the personal effects survive immersion? They tested materials in seawater. They spent months planning the fake life of a dead man, writing love letters he would never send, creating bills for clothes he would never wear, choosing a photograph of a woman he would never meet. And it worked. The Germans bought it completely. This is what intelligence work actually looked like. Not glamorous, not clean, weird, macabre, ethically questionable theatre, but effective. Devastatingly effective. The double-cross system, Pujol's fictional spy ring, the corpse in Spain, the Phantom Army at Calais, all of it, these were not side projects. This was central to Allied victory. The deception campaigns arguably saved more lives than any single battle. By making Germany position forces in the wrong places, by making them waste resources defending against fake threats, by making them doubt their own intelligence, the Allies changed the course of the war without firing a shot. But there was a cost. Not just the lives traded for secrets like we talked about before. A different cost. The cost of living a lie for years. The people running these operations, the double agents, the planners, they spent years constructing and maintaining elaborate fictions. They had to keep track of dozens of fake identities. They had to remember which lies they told to whom. They had to live in a world where nothing was what it seemed. And after the war, most of them still could not talk about it. The double-cross system stayed classified for decades. Pujol faked his death partly because he did not want anyone knowing what he had done. The people who planned Operation Mincemeat took the details to their graves. They won the war by lying. And then they had to lie about lying. For the rest of their lives. I wonder sometimes what that does to a person. To spend years making up elaborate stories, watching people believe them, watching those lies change the course of history, and then never being able to tell anyone. You just go back to normal life, get a job, raise a family, and inside your head, you know things. You know you helped trick an entire military apparatus. You know people died or lived based on whether your lies were believed, and you carry that in silence. Maybe that is the real intelligence war. Not the one between countries. The one inside yourself. Between what you know and what you can say. Between what you did and what you can admit. Let me ask you a question. Who won World War II? If you went to school in America or Britain, you probably learned that the Allies won. D-Day, the Battle of Britain, island hopping in the Pacific, American industrial might, British resolve. That is the story, and it is true, as far as it goes. But here is a number, 80%. 80% of all German military casualties happened on the Eastern Front. Not in France, not in North Africa, not in Italy, in the Soviet Union. Of the roughly 5 million German soldiers who died in World War II, 4 million of them died fighting the Soviets. Think about that for a second. The war we learned about, the Western European War, the one with all the movies and documentaries and books, that was 20% of where Germans actually died. The other 80% happened in a place we barely talk about. Why? Why did the Western narrative minimize the Soviet role so thoroughly? Because 15 minutes after the war ended, the Cold War started, and you cannot spend 50 years calling the Soviets the enemy while also acknowledging they did most of the dying that defeated Hitler. It is politically inconvenient. So, we learned about D-Day. We learned about Patton and Montgomery and Eisenhower. We learned about the liberation of Paris. All true, all important. But we did not learn about Rzhev. Ever heard of Rzhev? Most people have not. It was a city about 130 miles west of Moscow. From January 1942 to March 1943, Soviet and German forces fought over this city and the surrounding area in a series of battles that lasted 15 months. The casualties were approximately 2 million. 2 million dead, wounded, captured. More than Stalingrad, more than Kursk, more than any other battle on the Eastern Front. 2 million people. And it barely gets mentioned in Western histories of the war. The Soviets did not talk about it much either. They lost. Technically, Germany withdrew from Rzhev in March 43 as part of a strategic retreat. But the Soviets had spent over a year trying to take it, and failed repeatedly. After the war, Rzhev did not fit the narrative of Soviet triumph. So it got downplayed. But the soldiers who fought there, they knew. There is a Russian poem about Rzhev. I was killed near Rzhev, in a nameless swamp. In the West? We have never heard of it. Let me give you context for how the Eastern Front worked. The scale was completely different from anything in Western Europe. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, started on June 22, 1941. Germany attacked with 3 million men. The largest invasion force in human history. By December, they had advanced hundreds of miles. They were at the gates of Moscow. They had captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers. The Soviet Union should have collapsed. Every military analyst expected it to collapse. It did not. And the reason it did not is more complicated than just Russian winter or German overextension. The Soviet Union survived partly because of sheer population. They had manpower Germany could not match. But that is not the whole story. Because in 1936 and 1937 and 1938, Stalin had systematically destroyed his own military leadership. The Great Purge. You have probably heard of it. Stalin's paranoid campaign to eliminate anyone he saw as a potential threat. Millions of people arrested, executed, sent to camps. Political figures, intellectuals, ordinary citizens, but also military officers. Lots of military officers. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin executed about 35,000 military officers. Not imprisoned, executed, senior commanders, experienced battlefield leaders, people who had fought in World War I, who had led forces in the Russian Civil War, who actually knew how to run an army. One of them was Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, brilliant military theorist, advocate for mechanized warfare. He understood tanks and combined arms operations better than almost anyone in Europe at the time. Stalin had him arrested in May 1937, charged with treason and espionage. The evidence was fabricated. Tukhachevsky was tortured into confessing to crimes he did not commit. He was executed on June 12, 1937, shot in the head, along with him dozens of other senior officers. 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, half of the officer corps. Stalin decapitated his own military 4 years before the war started. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Red Army had almost no experienced leadership. Junior officers had been rapidly promoted to fill the gaps, but they had no training for senior command. They had no experience. They were terrified of making mistakes because mistakes could get you accused of sabotage and shot. This is why the Soviet Union lost so badly in the first 6 months. Not just because Germany was strong, because Stalin had gutted his own army. 3 million Soviet soldiers captured by December 1941. Most of them died in German POW camps. Starvation, disease, exposure. Germany did not apply Geneva Convention protections to Soviet prisoners. They were considered subhuman, expendable. Of the roughly 5.5 million Soviet soldiers captured during the war, about 3.5 million died in captivity. 60% death rate. And here is the really dark part. If you were a Soviet soldier and you got captured, Stalin considered you a traitor. There was an order. Order number 270. Any soldier who surrendered was an enemy of the state. If you escaped from a German POW camp and made it back to Soviet lines, you were not welcomed home. You were interrogated, suspected of collaboration. Many returning POWs were sent directly to Soviet labor camps. You could be captured by the Germans, survive a death camp, escape, make it back to your own army, and be sent to a gulag because Stalin did not trust anyone who had been in enemy hands. This was the Soviet war. Not just fighting Germans, fighting your own leadership's paranoia. There was another order, Order 227, issued July 28, 1942. Not one step back. Any soldier who retreated without orders was subject to execution. Any commander who allowed retreat was subject to execution. They created blocking detachments, units whose job was to stand behind the front line and shoot anyone who ran. If you advanced and got killed by Germans, you died for the motherland. If you retreated and got killed by your own blocking detachment, you died as a coward. Either way, you died. They also created penal battalions, Strafbats. If you were accused of cowardice or desertion or defeatism, you could be sent to a penal battalion instead of being shot. The penal battalions were given the worst assignments, charging machine gun nests, walking through minefields to clear paths for regular troops. It was a death sentence with extra steps. But technically, you were being given a chance to redeem yourself through sacrifice. Hundreds of thousands of men went through the Strafbats. Most did not come out. This is not Nazi propaganda. This is documented Soviet policy. We have the orders. We have survivor testimony. We have the records. The Soviet Union defeated Germany, partly through incredible courage and sacrifice, but also partly through brutal, inhuman enforcement. They threw bodies at the problem until the problem went away. And it worked. Horribly, it worked. By 1943, the tide was turning. Their commanders, the ones who survived, were gaining experience. And they had help. Help that the Soviet Union did not like to talk about during the Cold War. Lend-Lease. The American program to supply allies with equipment and materials. Britain got Lend-Lease. China got Lend-Lease. And the Soviet Union got a lot of Lend-Lease. From 1941 to 1945, the United States sent the Soviet Union $11 billion worth of supplies. Adjusted for inflation, that is about $180 billion in today's money. Trucks. Over 400,000 trucks. The Red Army ran on American trucks. Food. Millions of tons of canned meat, sugar, flour, enough to feed an army. Locomotives. Rail cars. The Soviet rail system that moved troops and supplies ran partly on American equipment. Aircraft. tanks, radios, telephone wire, industrial equipment. Stalin himself admitted in private that without American trucks and food, the Soviet Union could not have moved its armies fast enough to win. He never said this publicly. Publicly, it was all Soviet strength and Soviet heroism, but in meetings with his generals, he acknowledged it. This is the complexity. The Soviet Union bore the weight of the war in Europe. They lost 27 million people, military and civilian combined, 27 million. That is more than every other Allied nation combined. No American city was leveled like Stalingrad. No British city was besieged for 900 days like Leningrad. No Western European country lost a quarter of its population like Belarus did. The scale of suffering on the Eastern Front is almost incomprehensible. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Entire regions depopulated. Millions starved. Millions executed. Millions worked to death. And the people who suffered were living under a regime almost as brutal as the one they were fighting. Stalin's Soviet Union was a totalitarian nightmare. The NKVD was everywhere. Dissent meant death. Failure meant death. But those people still fought. They still held. They still pushed back. Were they fighting for Stalin? Some were. Many were fighting for their homes, for their families, for survival. Because if Germany won, it would be worse. Germany's plan for the Soviet Union was extermination and enslavement. General Plan Ost. The master plan for the East, killing tens of millions, starving the rest, colonizing the land with Germans. Soviet citizens knew this. They knew what was coming if they lost, so they fought. Not because Stalin inspired them, because the alternative was annihilation, and the Western Allies knew all this. Churchill knew about the purges. Roosevelt knew about Order 227. They knew Stalin was a brutal dictator, but they needed him. Germany had to be fought somewhere. If the Eastern Front collapsed, if the Soviet Union fell, Germany would control everything from France to the Urals. All those divisions fighting in Russia would be free to defend France. D-Day would be impossible, so the West sent supplies. They praised Soviet heroism. They called Stalin Uncle Joe. They downplayed the gulags and the executions and the blocking detachments. And after the war, when the Cold War started, they stopped talking about the Soviet contribution. It became inconvenient to acknowledge that the communist enemy had done most of the dying to defeat fascism. So the narrative shifted. The Western Front got emphasized. D-Day became the turning point. Hollywood made movies about American soldiers liberating Europe. The Eastern Front became a footnote. Rzhev disappeared. The millions who died fighting from Moscow to Berlin faded from the story. Not because it was not important, because it was politically complicated. The truth is, World War II in Europe was primarily a Soviet-German war. The Western Allies were important. They mattered. But the bulk of the fighting, the bulk of the dying, happened in the East. And we lost that story. We let it fade because it did not fit the Cold War narrative we needed. But the story is still there. In Russian memorials, in the ruins of cities that were rebuilt, in the absence of the millions who never came home, they died fighting the same enemy we were fighting, under a leader almost as monstrous as the one they opposed. And we forgot them because remembering was inconvenient. That is the hidden Eastern Front. Not hidden because it was secret, hidden because we chose not to look. There is a phrase they used, dehousing. That was the official term, dehousing. Making people homeless, destroying residential areas to disrupt worker morale and industrial production. It sounds clinical when you say it like that. Antiseptic, like you are just removing houses from an equation. But dehousing is not what happens when you drop incendiary bombs on a city. Let me tell you what actually happens. July 24th, 1943, Hamburg, Germany, a port city, shipyards, U-boat construction. Legitimate military target, no question. The British Royal Air Force had been bombing Hamburg for weeks. But this night was different. This night, conditions aligned in a way nobody had quite predicted. The weather was hot. dry. There had been no rain for weeks. The air was humid, but the ground was parched. And the RAF dropped a new mix of bombs. High explosives to blow open buildings, then incendiaries. The fires started. Separate fires, dozens of them, hundreds. And then something happened that the bomber crews had not fully anticipated. Though some scientists had theorized it might be possible, the fires merged. They created their own weather system. A firestorm. The heat rising from the burning city created an updraft so powerful it sucked in air from the surrounding areas. Wind. Not natural wind. Wind created by fire. Winds of hurricane force pulling toward the center of the inferno. The temperature at the center reached somewhere between 1400 and 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt glass. Hot enough that asphalt streets caught fire. People who had taken shelter in basements suffocated because the fire consumed all the oxygen. People who ran into the streets were caught by the wind and pulled into the flames. Some people tried to cross streets and got stuck in melted asphalt. They burned alive, trapped. The firestorm burned for 3 hours. When it was over, about 40,000 people were dead. Most of them civilians. Women, children, elderly, workers, families. The British called it Operation Gomorrah. Biblical reference. The city god destroyed with fire from heaven for its wickedness. The man who planned it was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris. The British called him Bomber Harris. The Germans called him Butcher Harris. He preferred the first name. Harris believed in area bombing, strategic bombing of cities. Not precision strikes on factories or rail yards. Broad attacks on residential neighborhoods where workers lived. His philosophy was that if you destroyed enough homes, killed enough workers, terrified enough civilians, eventually the enemy population would lose the will to fight. They would demand their government surrender. It was a theory. A theory that required burning cities full of people to test. Hamburg was proof of concept. The firestorm worked. It killed tens of thousands. It destroyed square miles of the city. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, devastatingly effective. So they did it again. Dresden, February 13th and 14th, 1945. Late in the war, Germany was already losing. The Red Army was advancing from the east. American and British forces were pushing from the west. The war was essentially over, just a matter of time. Dresden was a cultural center. Baroque architecture, museums, churches. It had some industry, some rail infrastructure, but it was not a major military target. It was also full of refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. The population had swelled from about 600,000 to maybe 1 million people, though nobody knows exactly. The RAF and the US Army Air Force hit Dresden with wave after wave of bombers. Temperatures so high that people in bomb shelters were incinerated, reduced to ash. The death toll is still debated. The official estimate is around 25,000. Some historians say it was higher, some say lower. But whatever the number, most were civilians, and the military value of bombing Dresden in February 1945 was questionable at best. Churchill himself seemed to have doubts. After Dresden, he wrote a memo questioning whether the bombing campaign had gone too far. He later retracted the memo, but the doubt was there. Even he was not sure anymore if this was justified. Harris was sure. Harris never doubted. He believed that bombing cities shortened the war, saved Allied lives. He thought the morality was simple: them or us. After the war, there was a United States strategic bombing survey. Analysts went through all the data, interviewed German civilians and officials, looked at production records and morale reports. Their conclusion? Strategic bombing of cities did not break civilian morale. It did not make Germans want to surrender. If anything, it hardened resolve. People got angry. They wanted revenge. They kept working. The bombing did disrupt production. It did damage infrastructure. Precision bombing of specific factories and rail yards was effective, but the broad area bombing, the firestorms, the dehousing, the survey found it was not worth the cost. 40,000 people died in Hamburg. It did not shorten the war. It did not break German will. It just killed 40,000 people. But here is the thing. The British did not know that in 1943 they were trying to win a war. Germany was bombing British cities. The Blitz had killed 40,000 British civilians. London, Coventry, Southampton, Liverpool. Why should Germany's cities be spared? And there was a darker calculation. Britain could not invade Europe alone. Not in 1943. The army was not big enough. So what could Britain do? Bomb. Bombing was something Britain could do while waiting for America to build up forces for an invasion. It kept pressure on Germany. It showed the Soviets that the Western Allies were fighting too. Not just sitting back, it gave the British public a sense that they were hitting back, that they were not just enduring, they were inflicting. So they bombed. Night after night. Harris sent his crews out. Young men, barely 20 years old, flying bombers over Germany, dropping fire on cities, watching them burn, flying home, doing it again the next night. The bomber crews had the highest casualty rate of any British service branch. 55,000 aircrew killed. Out of 125,000 who served, almost half. If you flew bombers for the RAF, you were more likely to die than survive. They knew this. They flew anyway. Were they war criminals? They thought they were shortening the war, saving lives overall. And maybe some of them did not think about it too much. You cannot function if you dwell on the fact that you just burned alive thousands of people, so you do not dwell on it. You do your job. You follow orders. You survive another night. Now let me tell you about something that killed more people in one night than either atomic bomb. Tokyo. March 9th and 10th, 1945. Japan was losing the war. Everyone knew it. The Japanese Navy was destroyed. The army was being pushed back on every front. American forces were island-hopping toward the home islands. General Curtis LeMay was in charge of the bombing campaign against Japan. He was 38 years old. Young for that much responsibility, he had a reputation as a man who got results, a man who did not let morality slow him down. LeMay looked at the problem. Tokyo was full of wooden buildings, paper screens, narrow streets. It would burn beautifully. He changed tactics. Instead of high-altitude precision bombing, he sent his B-29 seconds in low, 334 bombers, loaded with incendiaries, napalm and magnesium. They came in at 5,000 feet instead of the usual 20,000. The firebombing of Tokyo started just after midnight. The bombers dropped their loads in a pattern designed to create a ring of fire, then fill in the center, trap people inside. It worked. The fires merged into a firestorm. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned. The heat was so intense that canals boiled. People jumped into rivers to escape the flames and were boiled alive. The heat sucked oxygen out of the air. People suffocated in bomb shelters just like in Hamburg. The estimated death toll is 100,000 people in one night, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki. LeMay knew exactly what he was doing. He said later that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He said it matter-of-factly. No regret, no doubt. His calculation was simple. Killing 100,000 Japanese civilians in March would save American lives in November when the invasion of Japan began. Maybe save Japanese lives too, because an invasion would be even bloodier. Cold logic. Utilitarian. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But here is what haunts me about this. LeMay bombed Tokyo in March. The atomic bombs dropped in August. Japan surrendered in August. There was no invasion. Did burning Tokyo help end the war? Maybe. Probably. It showed Japan that America could destroy their cities at will. It killed war industry workers. It disrupted production. But 100,000 people burned alive in one night. You can justify almost anything with the right framing. If it saves more lives later, if it shortens the war, if the alternative is worse. But standing in front of that 100,000, explaining to them why it was necessary, why their deaths were acceptable losses, why burning them alive was the moral choice. I do not know how you do that. The bomber crews who flew that mission, they saw it. They smelled it. Burning human flesh has a smell. It got into the aircraft. Some crews vomited. Some broke down after landing, but they flew the next mission. And the next. LeMay kept sending them. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, city after city. By August, Japan's major cities were burned out. There were not many targets left. That is part of why the atomic bombs hit relatively small cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The big cities were already destroyed by conventional firebombing. After the war, nobody was tried for the bombing campaigns. Not Harris, not LeMay. Strategic bombing was not considered a war crime. It was considered warfare. The people who planned the Holocaust were hanged. The people who planned the firebombing of Tokyo got promotions. LeMay went on to command Strategic Air Command. Harris got a promotion to Marshal of the Royal Air Force. The difference, legally, was intent. The firebombing was warfare. Killing to achieve military objectives. But from the perspective of a child burning to death in Tokyo, is there a difference? You are dead either way. You did nothing to deserve it either way. War makes these distinctions. We need them. We need to believe there is a difference between us and them, between legitimate warfare and atrocity. But the line gets blurry when you look at 40,000 bodies in Hamburg, 25,000 in Dresden, 100,000 in Tokyo. We won. So we got to decide that our bombing was justified and theirs was not, that our civilian deaths were tragic but necessary, and theirs were the cost of supporting an evil regime. Maybe that is true. Maybe there is a moral difference. Germany and Japan started the war. They committed atrocities. They had to be stopped. But the people who burned did not start the war. They were just living in cities that became targets. They were factory workers and shopkeepers and children and grandmothers. And they burned because someone calculated that their deaths would help end the war faster. And maybe it did. Maybe Harris and LeMay were right. Maybe the bombing saved lives overall. But you cannot ask the 100,000 dead in Tokyo if they think it was worth it. They do not get a vote. This is the decision to bomb. Not the sanitized version. Not the strategic analysis. The actual reality of it. Fire, heat, suffocation, bodies, children, screaming, melted asphalt, boiling water, the smell that got into the aircraft and would not come out. We did that, the good guys, the allies, the liberators. We did it deliberately. We planned it carefully. We executed it efficiently, and it probably helped us win the war. I do not have a clean answer for you. I do not know if it was right or wrong. And I know that nobody involved lost much sleep over it. They thought they were heroes. Or maybe we just tell ourselves that so we can live with what we did. We use the word allies like it means friends. Like it means people who trust each other. People working toward the same goal with the same values. That is not what it meant in World War II. Allies meant people who happened to share an enemy. That is all. Sharing an enemy does not make you friends. It just means you are not currently killing each other. Sometimes not even that. July 3rd, 1940. The war is 11 months old. France has just fallen to Germany. The French government has surrendered. They have signed an armistice. France is now split. Northern France occupied by Germany, southern France governed by a French regime based in the town of Vichy. The Vichy government claims neutrality, claims it is not collaborating with Germany, just administrating the unoccupied zone. This is mostly a lie, but it is the official position. Britain has a problem. France had a navy, a powerful navy, the fourth largest in the world. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. And under the terms of the armistice, those ships are supposed to be demilitarized. Parked in French ports, disarmed. No threat to anyone. Churchill does not believe this. He thinks Germany will seize the French fleet or pressure Vichy France to hand it over. And if Germany gets the French navy, suddenly the balance of naval power shifts. Britain could lose control of the Mediterranean, could lose the ability to protect convoys. So, Churchill makes a decision. He sends the Royal Navy to French naval bases with an ultimatum. Sail your ships to British ports and join us. Or sail them to neutral ports and demilitarize them. Or scuttle them. but you are not keeping them in French ports where Germany can take them. The largest French fleet is at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria. The British send a squadron. They deliver the ultimatum. The French admiral refuses. He says the French fleet will never fall into German hands. He says France will scuttle the ships before allowing that. But he will not sail them to Britain. He will not abandon French sovereignty. The British admiral has his orders. If the French refuse, open fire. The French refuse. The British open fire. They shell the harbour. They hit battleships at anchor. The French scramble to respond, but they are caught completely unprepared. They thought the British were bluffing. They thought surely allies would not attack each other. Within 10 minutes, 3 French battleships are destroyed or damaged. The French are stunned, outraged. This is betrayal. This is murder. They had just been fighting Germany alongside Britain, and now Britain is killing them. Vichy France breaks diplomatic relations with Britain. French ships in other ports resist British attempts to seize them. In some cases, they fight back. French and British sailors killing each other. This creates a rift that lasts for years. Even after Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle start fighting alongside the Allies, there is bitterness. De Gaulle never forgives Churchill completely. French soldiers and sailors remember Mers el-Kebir. Some of them hate the British more than they hate the Germans. And here is the complexity. Churchill was probably right. If Germany had gotten the French fleet, it would have changed the war. Britain might have lost control of the Mediterranean, might have lost the ability to supply Egypt and the Middle East, might have lost access to the Suez Canal, but tell that to the families of the 1,200 French sailors. Tell them it was necessary. Tell them it was strategic. They just know their sons and husbands and brothers were killed by an ally while docked in a French port. This is what alliances actually looked like. Willingness to kill each other if the strategic situation demanded it, and France was not the only ally Britain and America betrayed. Let me tell you about Poland. Poland was why Britain entered the war. Germany invaded Poland. Britain had a treaty with Poland, guaranteeing their independence. So Britain declared war to defend Poland. Except, Britain did not actually defend Poland. Could not. Geography made it impossible. Britain had no way to get forces to Poland quickly enough to matter. Poland fought alone for a month. Then Germany and the Soviet Union divided the country, and Poland ceased to exist. The Polish government fled into exile, set up in London. Polish pilots flew in the Battle of Britain. Polish soldiers fought in North Africa and Italy. The Polish resistance, the Home Army, fought German occupation continuously. Poland never surrendered, never collaborated, just kept fighting. And then came August 1944. The Soviet Red Army was approaching Warsaw from the east. The German occupation was collapsing. The Polish Home Army saw an opportunity. If they could liberate Warsaw themselves before the Soviets arrived, they could establish Polish sovereignty. They could prevent Poland from just being handed to Stalin. So on August 1st, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began. 40,000 Polish resistance fighters attacked German positions in the city. They thought the Soviets would help. The Red Army was just across the Vistula River, 10 miles away. Surely they would support the uprising. Surely they would attack the Germans from the east while the Poles attacked from inside the city. The Soviets stopped. They sat on the east bank of the river and watched. For 63 days, the Polish Home Army fought the Germans in Warsaw, street by street, building by building. They were running out of ammunition, out of food, out of medical supplies. They begged the Soviets for help. Stalin refused. He said the uprising was premature. He said the Red Army needed to consolidate. He said Soviet forces were not ready to advance. All lies. The truth was Stalin wanted the Polish Home Army destroyed. Because the Home Army was loyal to the Polish government in exile in London. If they liberated Warsaw, they would claim legitimacy. They would be a problem for Soviet plans to install a communist government in Poland. So Stalin let the Germans do his work for him. Let the Germans kill the Polish resistance. Then the Red Army could occupy a Warsaw with no organized opposition. The Germans crushed the uprising. They executed prisoners. They demolished the city block by block. By October, over 200,000 Poles were dead. Then, after the uprising was defeated, the Red Army advanced. They took Warsaw in January 1945. There was barely any resistance. The Home Army was gone. The city was destroyed. Britain and America knew what was happening. They knew the Soviets were deliberately waiting. And Churchill did not push harder because he needed Stalin. The Red Army was doing most of the fighting in Europe. Alienating Stalin over Poland was not worth the cost. So Poland, the country Britain went to war to defend, was betrayed twice. Once when the Soviets invaded in 1939 and Britain did nothing. Again in 1944 when the Soviets let the resistance be slaughtered and Britain watched. After the war, Poland ended up under Soviet control anyway, for 45 years. The Poles who fought in British uniforms, who flew British planes, who helped liberate Italy and France, they could not go home. If they went back to communist Poland, they would be arrested, maybe executed, so they stayed in exile, in London, in Chicago, in scattered communities around the world. Britain had promised to defend Poland. Instead, Britain fought a 6-year war, and Poland ended up occupied anyway, just by a different power. This is what alliances meant in practice. Or look at Greece. Greece was invaded by Italy in 1940, fought them off. Then Germany invaded in 1941, occupied the country. The Greek king fled to Egypt. Greek resistance movements formed. The largest was communist, EAM-ELAS. Thousands of fighters. They fought the Germans. They also started fighting royalist resistance groups, because both sides knew the real war was not just against Germany. It was about who would control Greece after Germany left. By 1944, Greece was in civil war. Germans still occupied parts of the country, and Greeks were fighting each other. When Germany withdrew in October 1944, British forces moved in. Churchill was determined to keep Greece from going communist, so Britain supported the royalist factions, provided them with weapons, with troops. In December 1944, British forces were fighting Greek communist partisans in Athens. Because Britain wanted a monarchy and they wanted a republic. This was still during World War II. Germany had not surrendered yet. Japan was still fighting. And Britain was fighting a civil war in Greece to determine post-war political control. Churchill met with Stalin in Moscow in October 1944. This was the famous percentages agreement. They sat down with a piece of paper and divided up Eastern Europe. Romania, 90% Soviet influence, 10% Western. Greece, 90% Western, 10% Soviet. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Hungary, 50-50. They wrote it on a napkin, or something like a napkin. The details vary in different accounts, but the basic fact is clear. Churchill and Stalin divided countries into spheres of influence. Like property, like poker chips, the people who lived in those countries did not get a vote. Nobody asked the Romanians if they wanted to be 90% Soviet. Nobody asked the Greeks if they wanted British soldiers occupying Athens. Churchill and Stalin just decided. Drew lines. Made percentages. Shook hands. And this was not a conspiracy. This was not hidden. This was just how great powers operated. They did not pretend to care about self-determination or democracy, or the Atlantic Charter promises about people choosing their own governments. They just carved up Europe between them and went back to fighting Germany. Roosevelt was not at that meeting. He probably would not have approved, or maybe he would have. Hard to say. But Churchill and Stalin did not need his approval. They just did it. This is the reality of alliances. Not partners, competitors. Dividing up the spoils before the war is even over, making sure your side gets the best territory, setting up the next war while still fighting the current one. The word allies is a convenience, a label for temporary cooperation. It does not mean trust. It does not mean shared values. It just means not currently shooting each other. But sometimes not even that. Sometimes allies killed each other when it was strategically convenient. Merz-el-Kebir, Warsaw, Athens. We call them the Allies, like they were a team, like they were working together. They were not. They were rival empires with a common enemy. The moment the common enemy was defeated, they would turn on each other, which is exactly what happened. The Cold War started about 15 minutes after World War II ended. The alliances dissolved. Former partners became enemies because they were never really partners. They were just convenient. Let me tell you the story you learned in school. August 6th and 9th, 1945. 2 atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrenders 6 days later. The bombs ended the war. They saved lives. Saved American lives by preventing an invasion of Japan. Saved Japanese lives too, because an invasion would have killed millions. Simple story, clean story. Moral story, even. Terrible weapons used for a greater good. Now let me show you what was happening behind that story. What the official narrative leaves out. What stayed classified for decades. What makes the decision a lot more complicated than 2 sentences in a textbook. July 1945. The war in Europe is over. Germany surrendered in May. Now all Allied focus is on Japan. Japan is losing. Everyone knows it. The Japanese Navy is destroyed. Their air force is running out of planes and pilots. American submarines have cut off supply routes. Cities are being firebombed. The Soviet Union is about to enter the war against Japan. Japan knows it is losing. The question is not if they will surrender. The question is how. Under what terms? Here is what your textbook probably did not tell you. Japan was trying to surrender in July, not publicly, through back channels, diplomatic communications, through neutral countries. Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, Japanese diplomats were making contact, sending messages, feeling out terms. They were willing to surrender. They had one condition, one thing they would not negotiate. Keep the emperor. Do not remove Emperor Hirohito. Do not try him as a war criminal. Let Japan maintain the imperial system. That was it. That was the sticking point. On everything else, occupation, disarmament, war crime trials for military leaders, they were negotiating. But the emperor was non-negotiable. The United States knew about these communications. American intelligence was reading Japanese diplomatic cables. We had broken their codes just like we broke German codes. We knew exactly what Japan was willing to accept. And the official American position was unconditional surrender. No negotiations, no conditions. But here is the thing. After Japan surrendered in August, after the bombs, the United States kept the emperor anyway. We occupied Japan. We disarmed them. We tried war criminals, but we left Hirohito on the throne. We decided the imperial system could stay because it made the occupation easier. The Japanese people would be more cooperative if the emperor told them to cooperate. So we ended up giving Japan exactly what they were asking for in July. The condition we refused to negotiate became the policy we adopted in September, which raises a question. If we were going to keep the emperor anyway, why not accept that condition in July? Why not let Japan surrender with that one guarantee? Why drop the bombs if the terms we ended up accepting were being offered before the bombs? The standard answer is that we did not know Japan would surrender with just that one condition, that the diplomatic feelers were not serious, that Japanese military leaders were still committed to fighting, that the peace faction in Tokyo was too weak. Maybe that is true. Maybe Japan would have kept fighting even with a guarantee about the emperor. We cannot know for sure. But we have documents now, declassified cables, diary entries, meeting notes, and they complicate the story. Harry Truman became president in April 1945 when Roosevelt died. Truman had been vice president for 3 months. He barely knew Roosevelt. He was not briefed on most war policy. He did not even know the atomic bomb existed until after he became president. Suddenly, he is making decisions about ending the war, about using a weapon that had never been used before, a weapon that could kill 100,000 people in an instant. Truman's diary from July 1945 is revealing. He writes about the bomb, about the decision. He sounds ambivalent, uncertain. He writes that the bomb should be used on military targets, not on civilians. He does not want to kill women and children. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not purely military targets. They were cities. They had military facilities, sure, factories, ports, but they were full of civilians. When you drop an atomic bomb on a city, you are not making a distinction between soldiers and civilians. You are destroying everything. Truman's military advisors were divided. Some supported using the bomb, some opposed it. General Dwight Eisenhower opposed it. He said later that when he was told about the bomb, he expressed his grave misgivings. He thought Japan was already defeated, that using the bomb was unnecessary, that it would damage America's moral standing in the world. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, opposed it. He wrote in his memoirs that the atomic bomb was a barbarous weapon, that it violated every Christian ethic, that wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. General Douglas MacArthur thought the bomb was unnecessary. He believed a naval blockade and conventional bombing would force surrender without invasion or atomic weapons, but other advisors supported it. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, General Leslie Groves, who ran the Manhattan Project. They argued the bomb would shock Japan into immediate surrender, that it would save American lives, that an invasion of Japan would cost 1 million casualties. That number, 1 million casualties, it shows up everywhere in the justification for using the bomb. But where did that number come from? Historians have traced the estimates. In June 1945, military planners estimated invasion casualties at around 40,000. By July, some estimates went up to 200,000. Still horrible. Still a lot. The million number seems to have been created after the war, after people started questioning whether it was necessary. The estimates got inflated in retrospect to make the decision look more justified. This does not mean the bomb was wrong. It just means the justification got exaggerated over time. The story got cleaner. The math got simpler. 1 million lives saved sounds better than we were not sure, but we did it anyway. There is another theory. A darker theory. Some historians argue the bomb was not really about Japan. It was about the Soviet Union. Here is the timeline. The Soviet Union promised to enter the war against Japan 90 days after Germany surrendered. Germany surrendered May 8th. 90 days later is August 8th. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima August 6th. 2 days before the Soviets were scheduled to enter the war. Coincidence? Maybe. But maybe not. If the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria and participated in the defeat of Japan, Stalin would want a say in the occupation. He would want territory, influence, just like in Europe. The United States did not want that. Truman and his advisors did not want to split Japan with the Soviets the way Germany was being split. They wanted Japan to be purely American occupation. So maybe the rush to use the bomb was not about avoiding American casualties in an invasion. Maybe it was about forcing Japan to surrender before the Soviets got involved, before Stalin could claim he helped defeat Japan and therefore deserved a piece of the occupation. If that is true, then the atomic bomb was not really a weapon against Japan. It was a weapon against the Soviet Union, a demonstration, a message. This is the New World Order. American power. There is some evidence for this. At the Potsdam Conference in July, Truman told Stalin casually that the US had developed a powerful new weapon. Stalin did not react much, just said he hoped we would use it on Japan. Truman thought Stalin did not understand what he was talking about, but Stalin did understand. Soviet intelligence had spies in the Manhattan Project. Stalin knew about the atomic bomb before Truman told him. He just did not let on. So both sides were playing games. Truman was trying to intimidate Stalin with the bomb. Stalin was pretending not to know about it while accelerating his own atomic program. And in the middle of this great power chess match, 2 cities were destroyed. 200,000 people dead by the end of 1945 from the immediate effects and radiation. Were they necessary deaths? Did they end the war faster? The United States Strategic Bombing Survey was conducted after the war. Analysts interviewed Japanese officials, examined records, tried to understand what would have happened without the bombs. Their conclusion, published in 1946, Japan would have surrendered before November 1945, before any invasion. Even without the atomic bombs, even without Soviet entry into the war, The combination of naval blockade, conventional bombing, and loss of hope was enough. Japan was defeated. The government knew it. Surrender was coming. The bombs just accelerated a decision that was already being made. That is the official US government conclusion. Not a revisionist historian, not anti-American propaganda. The actual military survey. Japan would have surrendered anyway. So why drop the bombs? Maybe because Truman did not know Japan would surrender without them. Maybe because the intelligence about peace feelers was not clear enough. Maybe because no president wants to risk American lives when he has a weapon that might end things immediately. Or maybe because we spent $2 billion developing the bomb and we wanted to use it. Wanted to see if it worked. Wanted to send a message to the Soviets. Wanted to justify the expense and effort. Or maybe all of those reasons. Maybe there is no single answer. Maybe Truman made the decision based on incomplete information, political pressure, military advice, and personal judgment. And maybe he got it wrong. Or maybe he got it right. Maybe we will never know. What we do know is that the story we tell is simpler than the reality. The reality is that Japan was trying to surrender. The invasion casualty estimates were inflated. Some top military leaders opposed using the bombs. The Soviets were about to enter the war, and American analysts concluded after the fact that Japan would have surrendered anyway. All of that is documented. All of it is in the official record now. You can read Truman's diary. You can read the strategic bombing survey. You can read the cables from Japanese diplomats trying to negotiate surrender terms. And once you read all that, the simple story does not work anymore. It is not a clear moral choice. It is not obviously right or obviously wrong. It is complicated, messy, human. A president making a decision with incomplete information under enormous pressure with the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. And 200,000 people in 2 cities paying the price for that decision. I am not here to tell you Truman was wrong. I am not here to tell you he was right. I am just showing you what was in the documents, what was being said in private, what the actual estimates were versus what we were told later. You can decide for yourself what it means, but you cannot decide without knowing what was hidden, what was classified, what did not make it into the textbooks. The atomic bomb ended the war. That part is true, but it might have ended anyway. Japan might have surrendered without it. The invasion might never have happened. We used the bomb. We killed 200,000 people. And then we kept the emperor anyway. The thing Japan was asking for in July, we gave them in August. And for 70 years, we told a simple story about saving lives, about preventing an invasion, about a clear moral choice in a terrible time. But the people who made the decision, they knew it was not that simple. Their memos show debate. Their conversations show uncertainty. They made the choice. They lived with it. Most of them defended it for the rest of their lives. Maybe because they believed it was right. Maybe because admitting doubt would be unbearable. Either way, the bombs fell. The cities burned. The war ended. The war ended in May 1945. By June, American intelligence officers were already scouring Germany, looking for scientists. Not to arrest them, to recruit them. It started quietly. No official policy at first, just field officers making deals. You worked on rockets? Come with us. You worked on jet engines? We need you. You worked on chemical weapons? We have questions. What about your Nazi Party membership? What about the slave labor? What about the concentration camp prisoners who died building your prototypes? We will worry about that later. Right now, we need your expertise. By September 1945, this became official policy. A program. They called it Operation Paperclip. The name came from the method. Intelligence officers would paperclip new employment files over the Nazi records. Cover up the past. Create a clean history. Over the next decade, the United States brought in more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. Many of them had been committed Nazis. Some had been SS officers. Some had directly participated in war crimes. It did not matter. They had knowledge America wanted. Knowledge about rockets and jets and submarines and chemicals. Knowledge the Soviet Union also wanted. So it became a race. Get them before the Soviets do. The most famous is Wernher von Braun. You probably know his name. He designed the Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon. NASA hero, visionary, pioneer of space exploration. Here is what they did not put in the press releases. Von Braun was an SS officer. Sturmbannführer, that is a major. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937. He joined the SS in 1940. He designed the V2 rocket, the first ballistic missile. It was a terror weapon. Germany launched thousands of them at London and Antwerp in 1944 and 45. Each one carried a 1-ton warhead. They travelled faster than sound. No warning, just a sudden explosion. Killed thousands of people. But that is not the dark part. The dark part is where they were built. Mittelwerk, an underground factory complex in Germany. Built into a mountain, the V2 rockets were assembled there by slave labour. Prisoners from Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. 20,000 prisoners worked in that factory. They worked 12-hour shifts in tunnels with no ventilation. They slept in the tunnels. They barely got food. They were beaten if they worked too slowly. About 20,000 of them died. More prisoners died building V2 rockets than died from V2 rockets hitting London. The weapon killed more slaves in production than enemies in combat. Von Braun visited the factory regularly. He selected workers. He knew they were slaves. He knew the conditions. He knew people were dying. He later claimed he had no choice, that he was just following orders, that he tried to improve conditions. The survivors told a different story. They said von Braun was directly involved in selecting prisoners, that he showed no concern for their treatment, that he cared only about production quotas. After the war, American forces found von Braun and his team. They knew Americans would treat them better. They were right. The US Army brought von Braun and about 100 of his top engineers to America. First to Fort Bliss in Texas, then to Huntsville, Alabama. They were given jobs, salaries, comfortable lives. Their Nazi pasts were sanitized. Files were rewritten. War crime allegations were buried. When journalists asked questions, the answers were vague. He was just a scientist. He had to join the party to do his work. He had no real power. None of that was true. But it became the official story. Von Braun went on to become the chief architect of the American space program. He designed the rockets that put satellites in orbit, that put men on the moon. He became a celebrity. He appeared on television. Walt Disney made shows with him, explaining space travel to children. In 1975, he received the National Medal of Science from President Ford. The same hands that signed off on slave labor in underground tunnels received the highest scientific honor America could give. The slaves who built his rockets? They were not invited to the ceremony. Most of them were dead. The ones who survived were scattered. Some in displaced persons camps, some back in Germany, some in Israel. None of them testified. At Nuremberg, none of them got to face von Braun in court, because von Braun was too valuable to prosecute. He was not alone. Kurt Debius, another paperclip scientist, had been in the SS and the Nazi Party. He became the first director of Kennedy Space Center. Arthur Rudolph worked at Mittelwerk alongside von Braun. He became project director for the Saturn V. Hubertus Strughold did medical experiments on prisoners at Dachau. He became the father of American space medicine. The pattern was consistent. If you had expertise America wanted, your past could be overlooked, rewritten, forgotten. The Soviets did the same thing. They grabbed their own German scientists. Different people, but same idea. Use their knowledge. Ignore their crimes. It was not a secret exactly. But it was not advertised either. The American public did not know the man designing their rockets had built weapons with slave labor. They just knew he was a brilliant scientist who defected from the Nazis. That was the story. The rest was classified. Now let me tell you about the people who did not get recruited by superpowers. The ones who just wanted to disappear. After the war, thousands of Nazi officials were trying to escape. War criminals, SS officers, Gestapo agents, people who knew they would be arrested if they were caught, tried, hanged. Some of them had help. Not from governments, from the church, the Vatican rat lines. That is what they came to be called. Networks of Catholic clergy who helped Nazis escape Europe and flee to South America or the Middle East. The most prominent was a bishop named Alois Hudal, Austrian, rector of a German church in Rome. He was sympathetic to fascism, thought communism was a greater threat than Nazism. After the war, he helped Nazi fugitives get fake papers, passage on ships to Argentina or Brazil or Syria. There was also a Croatian priest named Krunoslav Draganović. He ran a network that helped Croatian fascists and German Nazis escape through Italy to South America. Thousands of people. He had connections to the International Red Cross. They issued travel documents. No questions asked. The Vatican itself claims it did not officially support these networks, that these were individual priests acting on their own. Maybe. But these priests operated openly in Rome for years. They used church facilities. They had access to Vatican resources. If the Vatican wanted to stop them, they could have. They did not. Through these rat lines, some of the worst war criminals in history escaped justice. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust. He escaped to Argentina using papers provided by this network, lived there for years under a false name, was not captured until 1960 when Israeli agents found him. Joseph Mengele, the doctor at Auschwitz who performed grotesque medical experiments on prisoners, lived in Brazil until he died in 1979, never faced trial. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, Gestapo chief in France, personally tortured resistance members, deported thousands of Jews. He escaped to Bolivia, and here is where it gets even darker. Barbie did not just escape, he became an asset for American intelligence. The US Army Counterintelligence Corps recruited him in 1947. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done in France. They used him anyway. He had intelligence on communist networks in Europe. He had contacts. He was useful. When France found out Barbie was in US custody and demanded extradition, the Americans lied, said they did not know where he was. Meanwhile, they were paying him, running him as an agent. Eventually it became too complicated, too many questions. So in 1951, the Americans helped Barbie escape to Bolivia, gave him new identity papers, put him on a ship. The rat line worked for American intelligence too. Barbie lived in Bolivia for 30 years, worked for the Bolivian government, helped train their security forces, helped hunt communists. The skills he developed torturing French resistance fighters, he used hunting Bolivian leftists. He was not extradited to France until 1983, finally stood trial, finally convicted. He died in prison in 1991, 46 years after the war ended. 46 years during which everyone knew where he was. Everyone knew what he had done, and nobody did anything because he was useful. This is the moral compromise at the heart of the post-war order. The worst people, if they had the right skills or the right information, could be forgiven, could be employed, could be protected, not officially. Nobody wrote a policy saying war criminals are acceptable if they work for us. But that was the practice. That was what happened. Von Braun supervised slave labor and got a medal. Barbie tortured prisoners and got a paycheck. Mengele experimented on children and got a quiet life in Brazil. Justice was negotiable, depending on what you could offer. And here is the thing that haunts me. It worked. The scientists we recruited helped America win the space race. The intelligence from former Nazis helped fight the Cold War. The expertise we gained probably did save lives by advancing technology and gathering information. So the calculation, the cold utilitarian calculation, maybe it was correct. Maybe using these people was the smart choice. Maybe the greater good was served. But when you make that calculation, you are saying something. You are saying that some crimes can be forgiven if the perpetrator is valuable enough. You are saying justice is less important than utility. You are saying the past does not matter if the present needs you. And once you say that, what does justice even mean? If the price of avoiding punishment is being useful to the right people, then justice is just power by another name. The people who died at Mittelwerk building rockets, the people Barbie tortured in Lyon, the people Mengele experimented on at Auschwitz. What do you tell them? That the man who killed them was too valuable to punish? That his expertise was worth more than their suffering? There is no good answer, just the reality. The man who worked slaves to death led us to the moon. We put his face on television. We taught children to admire him. We did not lie exactly. We just left things out, papered over the inconvenient parts. And maybe that is the real lesson. Not that we recruited Nazis. That is just pragmatism. Cold War realities. The real lesson is how easily we forgot, how quickly the narrative changed, how thoroughly the past could be erased when it was inconvenient. Within 10 years of the war, von Braun was a hero, a symbol of American ingenuity. The camps and the slaves and the deaths were just not mentioned, not denied, just quietly dropped from the story. And most people did not know, did not ask, accepted the clean version because it was easier than the complicated truth. The past is not fixed. It is written, rewritten, edited. The same facts can tell different stories depending on what you include and what you leave out. We included the rockets. We left out the slaves. And that became history. While nations fought nations, some individuals fought their own countries. When you fight an external enemy, your nation supports you. Your family is proud. Your community celebrates you. But when you fight your own government, you are alone. You are a traitor. If you are caught, no one will defend you. Your family will be punished for what you did. Your name will be erased or remembered as shame. And yet people did it anyway. Let me tell you about two students in Munich, brother and sister, Hans and Sophie Scholl, early 20s, medical student and biology student. They lived in Nazi Germany. Like everyone around them, they were supposed to support the war, support the regime. They could not. In 1942, they started a resistance group. They called it the White Rose. There were 6 core members, students, a professor, young people who looked at what Germany was doing and decided they had to speak. They did not sabotage factories. They did not assassinate officials. That sounds small, does it not? Pamphlets, words on paper, but in a totalitarian state, words are dangerous. The White Rose pamphlets called the Nazi regime evil, called the war a crime, called on Germans to resist, to sabotage the war effort, to recognize what was being done in their name. They printed these pamphlets at night. They mailed them to addresses picked from phone books. Professors, doctors, pub owners, people they hoped might read them and think. They left stacks in university buildings. They painted slogans on walls. Down with Hitler. They did this for months. The Gestapo searched for them, tried to track them down, could not find them, until February 18, 1943. Hans and Sophie brought a suitcase full of pamphlets to the University of Munich. They placed stacks in hallways before classes started. Empty stacks where students would find them. They had extras. Sophie made a decision. She climbed to an atrium balcony and threw the remaining pamphlets into the air. Let them scatter down into the courtyard. Make sure people saw them. A janitor saw her. He was a committed Nazi. Hans and Sophie were arrested within minutes. The Gestapo interrogated them. They admitted everything. They refused to give up the other members at first, but eventually the Gestapo found them. 4 days later, Hans and Sophie and one other member were tried. The trial lasted 3 hours. They were found guilty of treason. The sentence was death by guillotine. Sophie's last words were reportedly, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" She was 21 years old. Hans was 24. They were executed the same day, February 22, 1943. The other White Rose members were arrested over the following months. 3 more were executed. Others were imprisoned. The pamphlets did not stop the war. They did not overthrow Hitler. But they mattered. They showed that not all Germans were complicit, that some people, even knowing the cost, chose conscience over safety. After the war, the White Rose became a symbol, Schools were named after them. Squares and streets. They are honored now. But in 1943, they were traitors. Criminals. Their families were interrogated. Their friends were suspected. They knew this would happen. They did it anyway. Or look at the July 20th plot, 1944. By this point, Germany was losing. The Red Army was advancing from the east. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The war was not going to end well for Germany. A group of German military officers decided Hitler had to be removed. Not just for moral reasons, for practical ones. Hitler was making terrible strategic decisions, refusing to allow retreats. If Germany had any hope of negotiating a peace, Hitler had to go. The leader was Klaus von Stauffenberg, colonel, wounded veteran. He had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand in North Africa. He was a decorated officer, a patriot by any normal definition, but he hated Hitler, hated what the regime was doing, hated the war crimes. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg attended a meeting with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. He brought a briefcase. Inside was a bomb, British-made, 2 pounds of plastic explosive. He set the timer, placed the briefcase under the conference table, left the room on a pretext, waited. The bomb exploded. The room was destroyed. People were killed. He assumed Hitler was dead. But Hitler survived. He was shielded by the heavy oak table. He was injured, but alive. The coup failed. Within hours, the Gestapo was rounding up conspirators. They arrested hundreds of people. Anyone remotely connected to the plot. Stauffenberg was caught that night. He was executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the army headquarters in Berlin. His last words were, "Long live sacred Germany." Over the following months, the Gestapo conducted a purge. They arrested nearly 5,000 people. Trials were held in front of the People's Court. Most were sentenced to death. The executions were brutal. Many were hanged with piano wire. Slowly, Hitler ordered some of the executions to be filmed so he could watch. Families of the conspirators were arrested under Sippenhaft. Blood guilt. The idea that entire families were responsible for the crimes of one member. Wives, children, distant relatives, sent to camps. Some executed. This was the price of resisting, not just your own death. The destruction of everyone connected to you, and still people tried. Because living under a regime you knew was evil became unbearable. Because doing nothing felt like complicity. The resistance was not just in Germany. Japan had its own internal struggles. The Japanese government in 1945 was split between 2 factions. The war faction, mostly military leaders, wanted to fight to the last man. The peace faction, some admirals, some court officials, knew Japan was defeated. They wanted to negotiate, surrender, save what could be saved. The peace faction had to operate carefully. Openly advocating surrender was treason, could get you assassinated. Military extremists had killed politicians before, would do it again. Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, the Prime Minister in the last months of the war, was trying to find a path to peace, but he could not say so publicly. He had to speak in code, use vague language, hope the Allies would understand. Meanwhile, military leaders were planning for Ketsugo, the final battle, the defense of the home islands. Every civilian would fight, every man, woman, and child. Millions would die. But surrender was unacceptable. The peace faction was trying to prevent this, trying to convince the emperor to intervene, trying to find a way to end the war before Japan was annihilated. After the atomic bombs, after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the emperor finally made a decision. He would surrender. He recorded a radio address announcing it. The military extremists tried to stop it. They attempted a coup, tried to seize the imperial palace, tried to find the recording and destroy it, tried to prevent the surrender. The coup failed. The recording was broadcast. Japan surrendered. But the peace faction had been fighting for months, in secret, risking assassination, trying to save their country from a fanatical military that would rather see it destroyed than defeated. Or look at Italy. After Mussolini fell in 1943, Italy switched sides, joined the Allies. Italian partisans fought German occupation. 250,000 people. Resistance groups across the north. Communists, Catholics, socialists, liberals, united only by opposition to fascism and German occupation. They sabotaged rail lines, assassinated German officers, hid Allied prisoners of war, passed intelligence to the Allies, and they paid. Germans executed partisans when they were caught, executed civilians in reprisal. For every German soldier killed, 10 Italian civilians shot. The Ardeatine Massacre. March 1944, partisans killed 33 German soldiers in Rome. The Germans responded by killing 335 Italian civilians. They took them to caves outside the city, shot them, sealed the caves, 10-1. The math of occupation. But the partisans kept fighting. Because doing nothing meant living under occupation, meant collaboration, meant complicity. For 40 days in September and October 1944, partisans controlled a region called the Republic of Ossola, a small area near the Swiss border. They established a provisional government, democratic elections, freedom of press, a glimpse of what Italy could be. It lasted 40 days. Then German forces retook the area. The leaders fled to Switzerland. The dream ended, but for 40 days, they had shown it was possible. That resistance could create something, not just destroy. This is the pattern. Across Europe, across Asia, people within their own countries choosing to fight their own governments, knowing the cost, paying it anyway. The White Rose students executed at 21. Stauffenberg and 5,000 others hanged for trying to kill Hitler. Japanese peace advocates risking assassination. Italian partisans facing 10-1 reprisal killings. None of them won the war. The armies and the bombs and the factories won the war. But they mattered. They showed that nationality is not destiny, that being born German did not make you a Nazi. Being born Japanese did not make you a militarist. That individuals could choose, even when choosing cost everything. History remembers the armies, the generals, the presidents, and prime ministers. It should also remember Sophie Scholl throwing pamphlets from a balcony, Stauffenberg placing a bomb under a table, the Italian partisan hiding in mountains, the Japanese official quietly working for peace while pretending loyalty. They lost. Most of them died. Their efforts barely changed the course of events, but they chose. In impossible circumstances, they chose conscience over country. They chose what they believed was right over what was safe, and that matters. Maybe more than the armies. Because the armies were following orders. These people were defying them. That is a different kind of courage. The loneliest kind. The kind that does not get medals or parades. Just a grave. Maybe not even a marker, but still. They chose. 3 men sitting around a table can change more lives than any battle. Tehran, November 1943. The first time Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in person. The Big Three. They were there to coordinate strategy against Germany, plan the invasion of France, discuss the post-war world. They had dinner together. Stalin toasted Churchill. Roosevelt made jokes. They seemed friendly, like allies, like partners. Behind closed doors, they were already carving up Europe. Poland was the test case. Poland had been invaded by Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. The government had fled into exile in London. Poles were fighting in Allied armies, dying for the cause, expecting that when the war ended, Poland would be restored. Stalin had other plans. He wanted to keep Eastern Poland, the territory he had taken in 1939 under the secret deal with Hitler. He wanted Poland's borders moved west, take land from Germany, give it to Poland as compensation for what the Soviets were keeping in the east. This meant millions of Poles would be living in what would become Soviet territory. Millions of Germans would be living in what would become Poland. Simple solution: move them, expel the Germans, redraw the map, problem solved. Churchill and Roosevelt did not object. Not really. They made some noises about consulting the Polish government in exile. But they knew. They knew Stalin would do what he wanted. The Red Army was doing most of the fighting, most of the dying. So Poland's fate was decided in Tehran. Before the war was even won, the Polish government in London was not invited, not consulted, just informed later, told that the country they were fighting for was being given to Stalin, Yalta. February 1945. The most famous conference. There is a photo. You have probably seen it. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin sitting together. Roosevelt in the middle. Looking tired. Gaunt. He was dying. He had maybe 2 months left. He probably did not know that. But he was exhausted. Sick. Making decisions about the future of the world while barely able to stay awake through meetings. Churchill was frustrated. He knew Britain's power was fading. Britain had been bankrupted by the war. The empire was crumbling. After this war, Britain would be a secondary power. America and the Soviet Union would dominate. Stalin was patient, calculating. He held the strong hand. The Red Army was in Poland, in Romania, in Hungary, pushing toward Germany. He controlled the territory. Possession is 9/10 of the law. They negotiated. On the surface, it was about free elections, the right of peoples to choose their own governments, high-minded principles, the Atlantic Charter ideals. In reality, it was about spheres of influence. Who controls what? Poland, again. Stalin promised free elections. Elections that would never happen. A democratic government that would never form. Churchill and Roosevelt knew he was lying. They just could not do anything about it. There were secret protocols at Yalta too. Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany surrendered. In exchange, he got the Kuril Islands, southern Sakhalin, territory taken from Japan. The Japanese had no say. These were their islands. Their people did not matter. Stalin wanted them. Roosevelt agreed. Done. Think about that. 2 men dividing up Japanese territory while sitting in a palace on the Black Sea. The people who lived there were not consulted. Just woke up one day to find their nationality had changed. The war ended in May. Yalta happened in February. So for 3 months, everyone knew roughly how Europe would be divided. Before the fighting stopped, the borders were already drawn. Potsdam. July and August 1945, the last conference. Roosevelt was dead. Truman represented America. Churchill started the conference, but lost an election halfway through. Clement Attlee replaced him. Only Stalin remained from the original Big Three. He sat there watching British and American leaders change, while his position stayed solid. At Potsdam, they finalized Germany's division. Occupation zones. Soviet, American, British, French. Berlin divided the same way. Deep inside the Soviet zone, but split 4 ways. That division was supposed to be temporary. Lasted 45 years. They also formalized the border changes for Poland. The Oder-Neisse line. Poland shifted west. German territory became Polish. Polish territory became Soviet. This meant population transfers. Forced expulsions. Between 12 and 14 million Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe, from East Prussia, from Silesia, from Czechoslovakia, from Poland. Their families had lived there for generations, centuries in some cases. Did not matter. They were German. Germany had lost. They had to leave. Many died during the expulsions. Exact numbers are unclear. Estimates range from 500,000 to 2 million. Killed during the forced marches, died of disease or starvation, drowned when overloaded ships sank. The largest forced population movement in European history. Decided by 3 men in a room. The people being expelled had no say. Most of them had nothing to do with starting the war. They were farmers, shopkeepers, elderly people, children. Their crime was being born German in territory that was now going to be Polish or Soviet or Czech. They lost everything. Their homes, their land, their communities, everything built over lifetimes or generations. Gone, because a line was drawn on a map. Poland gained territory from Germany, but lost territory to the Soviet Union. Net roughly the same size, but millions of people displaced on both sides. Poles expelled from the east, Germans expelled from the west. Populations swapped like trading cards. The architects of this sat in comfortable chairs signing documents. They did not pack suitcases. They did not walk for weeks to reach a border. They did not sleep in fields or beg for food or bury children who died on the road. They just drew lines and signed papers. Here is what strikes me. The Cold War architecture was built before World War II ended. The division of Europe, the spheres of influence, the understanding that Eastern Europe would be Soviet and Western Europe would be American and British. This was decided while people were still dying on battlefields, while concentration camps were still operating, while cities were still being bombed. The next war was being planned during the current war. Stalin understood this perfectly. He was already thinking about security, about buffer zones, about making sure Russia would never be invaded from the West again. The Western allies were thinking about containing communism, about making sure Soviet influence did not spread too far, about maintaining access to resources and markets. Nobody was thinking about the people who would live in the zones they were creating, or if they were thinking about them, it was abstractly, as populations, as security concerns, not as individuals with homes and lives and dreams. When you operate at that level, at the level of nations and borders and spheres of influence, people become statistics. 12 million Germans expelled, 2 million Poles relocated. Numbers on a page, but each number was a person. Each one was a family torn apart, a home lost, a life disrupted. My grandmother used to say this thing. She said that wars are fought by young men who do not make decisions and decided by old men who do not fight. The conferences were where the old men made decisions. Roosevelt was 63, Churchill was 70, Stalin was 65. They had power over the lives of hundreds of millions. They would not suffer the consequences of their choices. They would not be expelled, would not starve on a forced march, would not live under occupation. Other people would do that. Younger people. The powerful men drew lines. The powerless people crossed them, carrying what they could, leaving behind what they could not. And here is the thing. Maybe it was necessary. Maybe the borders needed to be redrawn. Maybe the population transfers prevented future wars. Maybe giving Stalin Eastern Europe prevented him from taking Western Europe. Maybe the calculations were correct. Maybe the suffering was unavoidable. But it was still suffering. It still destroyed lives. It still separated families and erased communities and created generations of refugees and displaced persons. The conferences were efficient. Decisions made quickly. Papers signed. Done. The consequences took decades to unfold. Are still unfolding. Families separated by the Iron Curtain for 40 years. Communities that ceased to exist. Languages and cultures disrupted. Trauma passed down through generations. 3 men in a room decided. Millions of people lived with what they decided. That is power. That is what it looks like. Not glorious. Not noble. Just men in suits, making choices that other people will pay for. The photos from Yalta and Potsdam look formal, professional. Important men doing important work. What the photos do not show are the 12 million people packing their belongings, walking west, leaving home, never coming back. That is the hidden cost of the conferences, not what was decided. Lines on a map, numbers on a page. People turned into statistics so that history could move forward in a way that felt neat and organized and rational. But it was not neat for the people living through it. It was chaos, loss, grief, survival. The conferences that divided the world divided lives too. Split families, separated people from land they loved, created winners and losers based on which side of a line you happened to be born on. And the men who drew those lines never had to cross them. History remembers generals and battles, treaties and invasions. The big moments captured in photographs and headlines. History forgets the people who had no choice, who were just trying to survive, whose suffering was inconvenient to acknowledge. Let me tell you about 200,000 women whose names we will mostly never know. Comfort women. That is what the Japanese military called them. Comfort. as if providing sexual slavery to soldiers was a service, a kindness. Women from Korea, from China, from the Philippines, from Indonesia. Some were kidnapped. Some were lured with false promises of factory work. Some were just taken from their villages. Ages ranged from teenagers to women in their 30s. Most were very young. They were held in what the military called comfort stations, buildings near military bases. The women were raped repeatedly. 20, 30, 40 soldiers a day, every day, for months, for years, until they died or the war ended. The Japanese government denied this for decades, said it never happened, said the women were voluntary prostitutes, professional sex workers who chose to serve the military. This was a lie. We have documents now, military records, transportation logs, evidence of the system, evidence of coercion, evidence that this was organized policy, not individual crimes. But for 46 years after the war, Japan denied it. That speaking about it would bring shame to themselves, to their families, to their nations. Most did stay silent, carried the trauma alone, died without anyone knowing what had been done to them. It was not until 1991 that one woman broke the silence, Kim Hak-sun. Korean. She testified publicly, described what happened to her, named the system, demanded acknowledgement. Her courage opened the door. Other survivors started speaking. Slowly, carefully. Old women finally telling stories they had carried for 50 years. Japan issued apologies. Eventually, carefully worded, ambiguous, never fully accepting responsibility, never admitting it was systematic policy. The apologies were withdrawn or walked back by later governments. The surviving women are in their 90s now. Most have died. The few who remain are still asking for acknowledgement, for justice, for history to record what was done to them. 200,000 women, their suffering hidden because it was embarrassing, because acknowledging it would complicate diplomatic relations, because their pain was less important than political convenience. Or consider Bengal. 1943. Famines happen, you might think. Crop failures, natural disasters, tragic but unavoidable. Except the Bengal famine was not natural. It was policy. There was a drought. Yes, the rice harvest was lower than usual. But there was food. Not enough for luxury, but enough to prevent mass starvation if distributed properly. The British government prioritised war supplies over food relief. Grain was diverted to feed British soldiers, to build up stockpiles in case of Japanese invasion, to maintain military operations in Burma. Winston Churchill's government was warned, told that millions would starve without relief. Churchill's response, documented in cabinet meetings, was dismissive. He blamed Indians for breeding like rabbits. Asked why Gandhi had not died yet if the famine was so bad. Food relief was delayed, inadequate, mismanaged. Meanwhile, grain exports from India continued for months into the famine. Between 2 and 3 million people died, starved to death, while there was food in warehouses, while grain was being shipped out of the country. This is rarely taught in British schools. Churchill is remembered as the great wartime leader, the man who stood up to Hitler, saved civilization, the millions who starved in Bengal while he prioritized military supply lines, not part of the heroic narrative. Not because it is secret. The records exist. Historians have documented it. It is just not emphasized, not highlighted, not part of the story Britain tells about itself. Then there are the people who disappeared from their own homes, not killed, relocated. Stalin did this throughout the war. Suspected disloyalty, deport the entire ethnicity. Collective punishment. The Crimean Tatars, May 1944. The entire population, every Tatar in Crimea, accused of collaborating with German occupiers. Some had, most had not. Did not matter. Every Tatar, men, women, children, elderly, loaded onto trains, sent to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan, to Kazakhstan. 18% died during the deportation. Disease, starvation, exposure. The trains were not designed for people. cattle cars, no sanitation, no medical care, packed so tightly people could not sit down. The ones who survived arrived in exile, forbidden from returning, forbidden from speaking their language publicly, their property confiscated, their villages erased. The Chechens and Ingush. February 1944. 500,000 people, entire populations, deported in a single operation. 23% died within the first 4 years. The Volga Germans, ethnic Germans who had lived in Russia for centuries, deported in 1941. 1 million people, sent east, scattered, their autonomous republic dissolved. These were not individuals accused of crimes. These were entire peoples, punished collectively, erased from their homelands. The Soviet Union hid this, denied it. When it was finally acknowledged, decades later, it was described as necessary wartime security measures, preventing collaboration, protecting the state. But children were deported. How do you collaborate when you are 3 years old? You do not. You just happen to be born the wrong ethnicity, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then there are the stories of survival, the ones that do not fit neat categories of hero or villain. France fell in 1940. Germany occupied the north. Vichy governed the south. What do you do if you are French? Resist? Collaborate? Just try to survive? Most people tried to survive. They went to work, fed their families, avoided trouble. Is that collaboration? Or just survival? 340,000 French people volunteered to work in German factories for pay, for food rations, because their families needed money. Were they collaborators, traitors, or people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances? After the liberation, 80,000 people were tried for collaboration. Some were executed, many were imprisoned. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public, were paraded through streets, humiliated. Were all of them Nazi sympathizers? Some were. But some were just women who fell in love with a man who happened to be a soldier on the occupying side. Some were single mothers who traded sex for food to feed their children. Simple moral categories do not work here. Collaborator, resistor, victim, survivor. The reality was more complex, more human. People made choices, bad choices sometimes, choices they regretted, choices they had to make. And then after the war, those choices were judged by people who had not been there, who had not been hungry, who had not watched their children starve. These stories were buried, not because they are secret, because they complicate the narrative, because they show that war is messy and survival is complicated and people are human. The comfort women who were told to be ashamed, the Bengalis who starved while Churchill prioritized supply lines, the Tatars and Chechens who were erased from their homes, the French who made compromises to survive. History forgets them, not on purpose, just because their stories are uncomfortable. Because remembering them means acknowledging that the war was not just soldiers fighting, it was millions of ordinary people caught in forces they could not control, making choices they should never have had to make, suffering in ways that were never acknowledged. They deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, as people, as 200,000 women, as 3 million who starved, as 500,000 deported, as individuals who lived and suffered and survived or did not. Their stories are history too, maybe more important than the battles, because the battles are about power. Their stories are about what power does to people who have none. Some questions have answers buried in classified files. Some have answers that died with the people who knew them. And some might never have had answers to begin with. Just mysteries we tell ourselves must mean something. Rudolf Hess. We talked about him at the beginning. The deputy Führer who flew to Scotland in May 1941, supposedly on a peace mission, supposedly trying to negotiate with a British faction that wanted to ally with Germany against the Soviets. He was imprisoned for the rest of his life. 46 years. The British interrogated him, decided he was not worth much, handed him over to international custody after the war. He was convicted at Nuremberg, sentenced to life. He spent his final years as the only prisoner in Spandau prison in Berlin, a massive facility, built for hundreds holding one elderly man, 4 powers guarding him: Soviet, American, British, French. Every few years, there would be discussions about releasing him. He was old, no threat. The other powers would agree. The Soviets would veto it. Every time. Why? What was the Soviet Union afraid an elderly man would say if he were freed? August 1987. Hess was 93 years old. Guards found him dead in a garden shed, hanged with an electrical cord. Suicide, the official report said. His family did not believe it. Some historians do not believe it. A 93-year-old man with severe arthritis. Could he even tie a cord? Could he physically hang himself? Was he murdered? If so, by whom? And why? What secret was worth keeping for 46 years? We will probably never know. The files are sealed. The people involved are dead. Hess took whatever he knew to his grave. If there was a conspiracy, it succeeded. Or maybe there was nothing. Maybe he really was just a deluded Nazi who thought he could make peace and spent the rest of his life imprisoned for his delusion. Maybe the mystery is not a mystery. Just silence. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary. The man who controlled access to Hitler in the final years. One of the most powerful Nazis. Sentenced to death in absentia at Nuremberg because he had disappeared. For decades, there were rumors. He escaped to South America. He was living in Argentina or Paraguay or Brazil. Nazi hunters searched for him. Reported sightings. Always just out of reach. 1972. Construction workers in Berlin found a skeleton. Dental records matched Bormann. DNA testing in 1998 confirmed it. He had died in Berlin in May 1945, probably suicide by cyanide while trying to escape the Soviet advance. So the mystery is solved. Except some people still do not believe it. They think the skeleton was planted. That Bormann really did escape. That the German government closed the case because they did not want to keep looking. Maybe. Or maybe we just like mysteries more than mundane answers. Maybe the idea of Bormann living quietly in South America is more interesting than him dying in rubble in Berlin. Gold. Lots of gold went missing. Not just Nazi Party gold. Gold taken from Holocaust victims. Wedding rings. Dental fillings. Jewelry. Stolen from millions of people. Melted down. Turned into bullion. Stored in banks. Swiss banks held a lot of it. Neutral Switzerland. Banking secrecy. No questions asked. It took 50 years of pressure before they admitted it. Before they opened archives. Before they agreed to partial settlements with victims' families. Partial, not full, because we still do not know where all of it went. Billions of dollars worth. Disappeared into accounts, into vaults, into the system. Where is it now? In the portfolios of wealthy families who inherited it. In foundations and trusts that do not ask where the original capital came from, scattered so thoroughly through the financial system that it is impossible to trace? Probably. But we will never know for sure. Money is easier to hide than people, and Swiss banking secrecy protected a lot of secrets for a long time. The Amber Room, a chamber in Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg. Walls covered in amber panels. Gold leaf. Mirrors. One of the wonders of the Russian imperial collection. When Germany invaded, Soviet forces tried to evacuate it. But amber is fragile, breaks easily. They could not move it in time. German forces looted it. Took the panels, shipped them to Königsberg in East Prussia, displayed them in a castle museum. 1944. As Soviet forces approached Königsberg, the panels disappeared, crated up, moved somewhere. Nobody knows where. Theories abound. Hidden in a mine, sunk on a ship, destroyed in bombing, buried in a bunker. Every few years, someone claims to have found it, or a clue, or a map. Nothing ever comes of it. It is probably gone, destroyed, burned, or crushed, or lost to time. But the searching continues, because the idea of it existing somewhere is compelling. A puzzle waiting to be solved. The Nazi bell, Die Glocke, supposedly a secret weapon, a bell-shaped device that created some kind of field, anti-gravity. Evidence? Thin. A few reports from questionable sources. A mine in Poland where something might have been tested. Strange residue. Nothing conclusive. Is it real? Probably not. Probably just a legend that grew from incomplete records and imaginative speculation. But the files are classified in some archives. Which makes people wonder, if it is nothing, why classify it? Maybe the classification is about something else. About people involved. About locations used for other purposes. Maybe it has nothing to do with a bell. Or maybe there was a project, some kind of experimental weapon that did not work. That was abandoned. That we will never fully understand because the records are incomplete and the scientists are dead. May 1945. A German submarine surrendered to American forces off the coast. U-234, headed for Japan when the war ended. The captain surfaced and surrendered. In the cargo hold, uranium oxide, 80 kilograms, in canisters labeled for Japan's atomic program. Was Germany sending nuclear material to Japan? Were they collaborating on atomic weapons? How far along was Japan's program? We know they had one. We know they were researching. But how close were they? The uranium was seized. The submarine crew was interrogated. Records were classified. Some of it is declassified now. But not all. What are we still not allowed to know about technology transfers between Axis powers? About how close Japan came to a bomb? The pattern is consistent. So much sealed. So much classified. So much marked as lost or destroyed. Fire destroyed records. Bombing destroyed archives. Retreating armies burned files. Victorious powers seized documents and classified them for national security. All true, all reasonable explanations. Convenient that the most sensitive information is the hardest to verify. That the most troubling questions have the least available evidence. Maybe there are good reasons. Protecting intelligence methods. Protecting people who were informants. Protecting diplomatic relationships. Or maybe it is just easier to seal things than to explain them. Easier to classify than to confront. Either way, the questions remain. Hess's real mission. Bormann's escape or death. The location of looted gold. The fate of the Amber Room. Nazi secret weapons that may or may not have existed. Technology transfers we only partially understand. Some questions will be answered as more archives open, as more files are declassified. Some questions never will be. The people who knew are dead. The documents are gone. The trail is cold, and maybe that is okay. Maybe not everything needs to be known. Maybe some mysteries can just exist. Reminders that history is not complete, that our understanding is limited, that there are things we will never fully grasp. Maybe the question matters more than the answer. The wondering, the searching, the acknowledgement that we do not know everything, that we cannot know everything. Maybe it is enough to say, this happened. We are not sure why. We may never be sure, and that is just part of being human. Living with uncertainty, accepting the limits of knowledge. The war ended 80 years ago. We are still finding out things we did not know. Still opening boxes that have been sealed. Still discovering documents that change our understanding. And we will probably still be discovering things 80 years from now. Because history is not fixed. It is always being written. Always being revised. Always revealing new layers. The questions that remain will keep remaining. Some might get answered. Most will not. And we will keep asking them anyway. Because that is what we do. We wonder. We search. We hope that maybe, somewhere, an answer exists, even if we never find it. I do not have clean lessons for you. I do not have a moral at the end of this story. Just observations. Things that sit with me after looking at all these hidden decisions and buried stories. Information is power. We say that casually, like it is obvious. But the reality of it is darker than the phrase suggests. Having information means choosing what to do with it. Who to save. Who to let die. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park did not just read German messages. They decided which warnings to send and which to withhold. That is power. Terrible power. The kind that keeps you awake at night. And once you have that power, you cannot give it back. You cannot unknow what you know. You just have to live with the choices you made, carrying the weight of people you could have saved but did not. Moral clarity disappears the moment you have to make real decisions. It is easy to judge from a distance, from 80 years later, from the safety of knowing how it all turned out. But in the moment, nothing is clear. Churchill choosing not to evacuate Coventry, Truman deciding whether to use the atomic bomb, Stauffenberg planting a bomb to kill his own head of state. None of these people had the luxury of certainty. They just had impossible choices and incomplete information, and the knowledge that whatever they decided, people would die. Were they right? Were they wrong? I do not know. I think maybe those categories do not apply. Maybe there are just choices and consequences, and people trying their best with what they knew at the time, or trying their worst. Alliances are not friendships. We learned that. Britain and America and the Soviet Union were not partners. They were competitors who happened to share an enemy. The moment that enemy was defeated, they turned on each other. The Cold War did not start after World War II. It started during, in those conferences where they were already dividing up the world, already preparing for the next conflict. And the countries that trusted in those alliances, Poland, Greece, the Baltic states, they learned that promises from great powers are only good as long as they are convenient. The moment the strategic situation changes, the promises evaporate. You are on your own. History is written by victors. That is the phrase. But it is more complicated than that. History is written by whoever controls the archives, whoever gets to classify documents, whoever decides what gets taught in schools and what gets quietly omitted. The Soviet role in defeating Germany was minimized during the Cold War, not because it was not important, because acknowledging it was inconvenient. Good people make terrible choices. That might be the hardest thing to sit with. The code breakers who let convoys sink, the bomber crews who burned cities, the diplomats who traded millions of lives for spheres of influence. Most of them were not monsters. They were people doing what they thought was necessary, what their countries asked of them, what the situation demanded. Does that make it okay? No. Does it make it understandable? Maybe. Does it mean we should not judge them? I do not know. I just know that certainty is a luxury they did not have, and we should be careful about judging from a position of safety what people did in the middle of chaos. Secrecy has a cost. The lies we told, the truths we hid, the deals we made with Nazis and war criminals, the intelligence sources we protected by letting people die, all of that eroded trust, created cynicism, made people wonder what else their governments were lying about. And that erosion, that loss of faith, it shaped everything that came after. The conspiracy theories, the distrust of authority. Some of it earned, because we really were hiding things. We really were lying. What we hide shapes the future as much as what we remember. The stories we bury do not stay buried. They seep out. They create questions. They leave gaps in the narrative that people fill with speculation. Better to tell the truth, even when it is ugly, even when it complicates the story, because the alternative is worse. And yet, in all this darkness, in all these terrible choices and hidden crimes and moral compromises, there were individuals who chose differently. Sophie Scholl, throwing pamphlets knowing she would die. Stauffenberg, placing a bomb knowing his family would be destroyed. The partisans in Italy fighting knowing the reprisals. They did not change the outcome. They did not win. That matters. Maybe more than the grand strategies and the conferences and the battles, because it shows that people are not just products of their circumstances. That choice exists even in impossible situations. That individuals matter even when history barely notices them. People are capable of great horror. We saw that. The Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, the gulags, the firebombing. Humans did all of that to other humans. Deliberately, systematically, sometimes enthusiastically. But people are also capable of great heroism. Often quiet heroism. The kind that does not get medals. hiding a family in your attic, passing information to the resistance, refusing an order, small choices that cost everything. Both are true. Same species, same capacity. The circumstances and choices and moments that separate one from the other are thinner than we would like to think. I do not have answers. Just these observations. Just sitting with the complexity, with the messiness of human choices in inhuman circumstances, with the weight of decisions that shaped millions of lives. The war taught us that nothing is as simple as we want it to be, that the line between right and wrong gets blurry when you are actually standing on it, that good people do terrible things, that terrible people sometimes do good things, and that the stories we tell about it afterward are always simpler than what actually happened, always cleaner, always more certain, because we need them to be, because living with ambiguity is hard, because simple narratives are comforting, but the truth is not comforting. It is just true, complicated, messy, human, and maybe that is enough. Maybe we do not need clean lessons, just honest ones. We have traveled a long way tonight, through locked rooms and secret decisions, through choices made in darkness that shaped the light, through the hidden wars within the war. That is heavy. All of it. The weight of those stories, the complexity of those choices, the lives caught in forces they could not control. You have held that weight with me. You have listened. You have sat with uncomfortable truths. You have let the simple stories become complicated. That takes something. Curiosity. Yes, but also courage. The willingness to see things as they were, not as we wish they had been. And now you can let it go. All of it. The convoys that were not warned. The cities that burned. The people who were betrayed. The secrets that stayed hidden. The questions without answers. You can set it down. These are not your battles. These are not your choices to carry. Right now, in this moment, you are safe. You are lying somewhere comfortable. The war ended 80 years ago. The decisions have been made. The consequences have unfolded. History has moved on. And you can rest. You have done enough for tonight. You have learned. You have wondered. You have sat with complexity and ambiguity and the messiness of human choices in impossible times. That is enough. Let your shoulders relax. Let the tension drain away. Let the weight of these stories settle somewhere else. Not forgotten. Just not yours to carry right now. The secrets are still there. The mysteries remain. The questions we cannot answer will still be there tomorrow. They do not need you to solve them tonight. Tonight, you can just breathe. In and out. Slow. Easy. No effort. The hidden decisions of World War II shaped our world. But they do not shape this moment. This moment is yours. Quiet. Simple. Safe. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to let go. You are allowed to drift. History will still be there tomorrow. The stories will wait. The complexity will remain. You can come back to it when you are ready. Or not. That is up to you. But for now, let the darkness be just darkness. Not hiding anything. Not concealing secrets. Just the quiet dark of a room at night. Just rest. You have walked through shadow with me tonight. Through the parts of history they did not teach. The decisions they did not talk about. The people they forgot. And you have honored those stories by listening. By caring. By letting them be complicated instead of simple. Thank you for that. For your time. For your attention. For your willingness to sit with difficult truths. Now, rest. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind quiet. Let the stories fade into the background. They will be there if you need them. But right now, you do not need them. You just need sleep. And sleep is coming. Easy. Natural. No effort required. The war is over. The choices have been made. The world turned. And tonight, you can let all of that be. Let it rest. Let yourself rest. Just breathe. Just drift. Just let go. You are safe. You are allowed. You can rest now. Sleep well,